Mm, Introduction. Hello, world. This is us, your drum circle, crypto hippies in the house. Good to be back. We have a new person, two new people with us today. I'm Anthony. You've met me before, but would everyone else like to introduce themselves?
Yeah, Juan here.
And I'm Anastasiya, crypto anarchist.
Crypto anarchist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also
I'm
have
Yifan. No
Yifan.
association with crypto anything.
I'm Arielle. It's a say undecided category on all counts.
Nice.
All things conspiracy, non-conspiracy.
Did you say undecided?
Yeah.
Nice. That's good. Anarchy doesn't have to have any, like, you don't have to make any decisions in anarchy. Actually, it's funny,
Except
we
for
throw
all
that term around.
the decisions.
Yeah, every single decision.
You yourself.
Yeah.
So it's funny, we throw that term around anarchy, but it's like, it's a lack of something. It's like anarchy is a lack of a government, right? It's not necessarily a system, it's a lack of a thing. So it's kind of, in a way, it's like almost like a contradictory kind of thing, because you're like, okay, I could say like, I'm a, like, I don't know, you could make a lack of anything else. Like I'm a not flat earther, right? Like, okay, cool story, bro. Like,
Yeah, it's an adversarial identity. Like you have to define a target and then define yourself in opposition to them. Same thing with atheism. You have to identify a definition of God and then claim to not believe it, and that's your identity. It's not great. It's not a great position.
I guess like in a way like the different flavors of anarchy are like different positive visions. So you have like anarchy, which is like saying no to all these, to like, you know, state hierarchy, and then you have these different kinds of anarchism, which are like go first.
Yeah, and it serves purposes at certain times. Like, you know, I mean, there's a reason it happens, but anyway.
Like in introductions.
Yeah.
Where people kind of expect you to define.
In a very summarized way.
In a very summarized way, yeah, like where you're coming from generally.
Yeah. Cool.
So I think we started earlier, Arielle, you were saying that you just finished a book on conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it went through a whole bunch of them. It kind of started with like the ones that are, what?
You said you've read a whole bunch of books on conspiracy theories?
No, this one book I read went through a whole bunch of them.
Oh, okay.
I read on conspiracy theories.
Which ones did it cover?
Okay, well, the book is called Official Stories by Scheff, and it covered, basically started talking about like the conspiracies that are kind of known to be true, like the Bay of Tonkin in the 70s and stuff like that, like just all the shady stuff that the CIA was doing in the 70s that's been declassified. So those are like substantiated conspiracies. And then he went into the JFK assassination and 9/11, and he went into the anti-vaccination thing, and he actually doesn't believe that HIV causes AIDS. He doesn't believe in the Big Bang Theory, and he doesn't believe in plate tectonics. So he just kind of started with like the reasonable conspiracies, or the true conspiracies, and then it went to like some very, very questionable conspiracies.
Yeah.
So this is the author who doesn't believe in those things?
Yeah, the author of the book I read doesn't believe in those things.
Does he propose his own theories? Like, so if you say that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, then what does?
Yeah, that one, I don't agree with this theory at all. It's very out there, and it definitely seems like there's an infectious element to the spread of that disease. But he says that it's caused by like poor environmental conditions and like chemicals in the environment that break down people's immune systems.
I've heard before from a different source. There's a Latin American doctor that made a documentary in Spanish about basically the exact same case you made, and apparently he was curing people of AIDS in Africa through sheer nutrition and exercise by boosting their immune system. So I'm a skeptic too, especially because it's like is there a virus? What's the virus? Like, anyway, there's some details there. I'm not a biology or medical person whatsoever, but from what I've looked at, it's like, it smells a little weird. Anyway.
We could even take it to the extent to say something like I'm personally skeptical of the very concept of viruses themselves. I mean, obviously they exist. There are these things we can look at and catalog, but the model that we've accepted for what a virus does may or may not be accurate in all cases. Like, okay, maybe sometimes in some cases there's viruses that their goal is to feed off of a host and they could like totally kill you. But in other cases, I've heard the theory that viruses are actually just little bits of DNA that your body manufactures itself to accomplish some kind of specific purpose. In some cases, it might be some kind of like detoxification purpose, or so. In general, it's not that I disagree with the evidence, right? We collect a lot of evidence empirically, scientifically, but it's the interpretation of the evidence. I made a statement on a comment on Facebook, and someone was like, "Oh, you probably have no evidence for that, and it's stupid, and it's a dumb idea." And I was like, well, I didn't really respond to him, but it was like, well, just because some people interpret the evidence in one particular way doesn't mean that that's the way to interpret it, right? There could be other interpretations.
Yeah, that was the argument he was making in the book, that viruses are a natural mechanism in the body, and they just they kind of do the opposite of what RNA does. Like, they just bring information back to the DNA. But I mean, if we're drawing a parallel between bacteria, which we know a lot more about because they're bigger, and viruses, then I mean, maybe it makes sense that there's viruses that function as a natural part of the human body or symbiotically with us, but there's also viruses that are pathogenic. It seems like there's a lot of evidence that's really hard to explain without the pathogenic virus theory.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's just the addition of sort of the beneficial virus theory, or self-created within your own body kind of virus. Like when people get the flu, for example, or what they say is the flu. In some cases, like in a lot of cases, it could just be that that's the body's natural mechanism for detoxifying.
Just thinking of conspiracy theories. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of touch on there, Arielle?
Well, it's like a big topic. It's like 8 big topics.
Yeah.
I guess with the HIV thing, I don't really see how the argument that it could be like not infectious works when you have like people getting AIDS and HIV that are like just like medical technicians in the 1980s and stuff like that. Like, I don't like that's,
or like the whole presence of a population of kind of like well-nourished, healthy people with AIDS kind of is also a piece of evidence that it runs counter to that guy's theory.
Well, but rich people can also party themselves to death, or consume stupid substances. Like, I think during the break, and this is maybe completely ignorant, but during the breakout of AIDS in the United States in the 70s or 80s, like it was around the gay
the 80s,
or just partying hard, doing who knows what kind of drugs, drinking plenty of alcohol, and just just living the life. And it's like, yeah, okay, you can do that and you can be wealthy, but you're gonna also do some serious damage to your body, and then surprise, your immune system breaks down, right? I mean, that argument is plausible, but again, like, I'm not a medical person at all, so it's personal opinion anyway.
Well, I think part of what that argument relies on is this idea that diseases have multiple causes, which is true. Like any disease has multiple components to it. However, I guess the piece that is in contention is whether the presence of a pathogen is a necessary prerequisite for the disease to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it could be all of the above, like your susceptibility to that pathogen could be related to the state of your immune system when you're first introduced to it.
Mhm. Yeah, like this theory is kind of like this I think the theory that wants to like de-emphasize infectivity. Like it says that like we're kind of bathed in pathogens all the time, and that the thing that separates a sick person from a healthy person is a sick person is like something is happening to weaken their immune system, like they're being exposed to pesticides or to they're partying too much or something is happening. Whereas the infectivity model would emphasize more the spread of like the pathogen through a population. And I think there's like a fair criticism that maybe like modern, like Western medicine de-emphasizes like especially like in the, like with the flu stuff, like de-emphasizes the role of like the immune system and like being healthy and fighting diseases, or like just like eating well and that kind of thing.
It's all about curing the symptoms, but never really getting to the root cause. And the root cause isn't necessarily always physical. It's also mental and emotional, and I think on some level spiritual too. Like, because all those things come in together and play together. If you're not in a good mental and emotional state, that would probably cause you to have more stress, which produces things in your body that make you more susceptible to getting sick. And the mental and emotional stuff could come from the spiritual things. Maybe you're not dealing something from your past and you've been suppressing something spiritually, or you're not, walking your path that could kind of like spiral you down into the physical sickness. Like that's usually how I see it, that usually all of these things start somewhere in the spiritual that you're not dealing with, and then they come down to your emotional and energetic, and then your mental, where you start thinking that maybe something is wrong, and that creates a negative feedback loop, and then all of a sudden something triggers it in the physical, and now you have to deal with it on this plane of existence through medication or diet, etc.
So Arielle, I'm curious about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, there's multiple layers to being an experience, right? And the problems can emerge at multiple levels, and it affects other layers below or above. So yeah, I mean, there's really interesting kind of like psychology mixed with kinesthetic, like sort of physiological experience, sort of stuff that ends up becoming sort of medical, or it's just medical that affects the psychological, and then some you cure it here and it fixes here. So there's there's plenty of complexity.
I
have a question. So does the author address in any way three of the immediate counter arguments that would come to my mind? Counter argument number one being the effectiveness of vaccines, number two being the effectiveness of antibiotics, and number three being like kind of a pretty robust pattern of infectiousness that can be attributed to disease-causing agents. Like, does he talk about that at all, or does he have evidence that he uses to dismiss any of those three items?
Can you rephrase the third one?
Yeah, like basically, when you model an infectious agent, like it does have a specific pattern as to how the disease spreads, and that can be applied to any disease. And to me, it seems like there's a lot of robust evidence for that model. So, like, if he's going to claim that diseases are not caused primarily by infectious agents, then in my mind, he would want to address the existence of that model.
Yeah, he does address the first two. He doesn't believe that vaccinations. He kind of thinks that vaccinations are a scam that sometimes work, from what I could tell. He was a little bit ambiguous about it. Like, he seemed to acknowledge that the smallpox, he was ambiguous about the smallpox vaccination. And basically there's like the anti-vaccine argument is
That's right.
So he definitely was making the anti-vaccine argument. He was saying that polio wasn't a real disease and it was just caused by DDT in the 50s. And then they redefined what polio meant, which is a hard argument to evaluate without doing a ton of research. But definitely, I don't see how the anti-vaccine argument can stand against like smallpox, because the pattern of it being eliminated from nature doesn't make sense unless you have like vaccines. I don't think he addressed the third point really, like that pattern of like exponential spread of disease through a population. You probably attribute it to like historical factors that make a population particularly susceptible to a particular disease. And as for antibiotics, he definitely acknowledges that they work, but I think the argument he would make is that they're used, they kill the pathogen and they kill a bunch of good stuff too, which makes you more susceptible to other pathogens in the future. It makes you more susceptible, like it weakens your immune system over time.
It's like chemotherapy. It probably works in a lot of cases, but obviously radiation causes cancer. So it's always that question of what's worse, the disease or the cure. We eradicated smallpox, and certainly I think, there's a lot to be said for that. It kind of, in a lot of ways, provides a lot of evidence to prove the concept of vaccination and immunity. At the same time, right, what else are they putting in those vaccinations that could be affecting us negatively?
Right, and how much does the medicine like chemotherapy help you versus how much it hurts you? Because it seems like Western medicine is, trying again to cure the symptoms, but then it creates all of these other symptoms that in some cases could actually be worse. Like you see all those medical commercials that go, oh, you could cure your heart disease, but then you could also get suicidal thoughts and depression, and you could be homicidal too, and it could cause all these other issues that are sound way more terrible than the original problem.
I don't know if I've ever heard in a commercial for some kind of medicine that side effects could be homicidal tendencies, but that probably should come with a lot of these psychotropic drugs that they're giving people.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Business model is kind of twisted.
Huge for profit.
In China, they have I've heard they have a business model. Doctors have a business model where you basically pay $20 every month type of thing. No matter what, you pay $20 every month, as long as you're signed up. But if at any point you get sick, it's on your doctor to make sure you're taken care of, and it's kind of like they have to incur a significant portion of the cost. So it's in their best economic interest to make sure you don't get sick. But in the West, is like the more money you have and the more sick you are, the better off they are. And so, like, profit isn't the only motive, but it's a strong enough motive that it sets trends at a market level. So
hey, that sounds dangerously close to accusations of conspiracy, Juan. Like as if there was some kind of like medical pharmacological conspiracy happening. I don't know. Why would anyone do that?
Well, we will have to. So this is the conversation that I actually want to have, which is sort of the meta-analysis of conspiracy theories, is a thing. Because like there's a field of study of economics where you can look at economic principles and stuff, but that specifically addresses financial motivation, and humans are multi-motivational creatures. We have multiple motivations, and so you can't, like, an economic analysis is not enough to pin down behavior, but it may be enough to identify the primary, like you have to
motive is always a factor, right? Anytime motive is always a factor when you're trying to prove a case in a court of law, right? Like, we've all seen kind of CSI, whatever. They're always trying to establish a motive, and that's kind of one of the crucial pieces of a case. Is if you can't establish any motive, then your case becomes weaker. Yeah.
Motive is a pretty useful thing when trying to figure out, I guess, sort of moral questions or ethical questions or something like that, right?
In terms of meta-analysis, I think it's a good thing to recognize that just because a motive does exist isn't proof that that thing is happening. It just means that, right, it's one piece among many required to establish a case.
Yeah, absolutely. Establish, let's say, doing by negligence, right? So somebody can just do things, without intent and have massive effects, negative effects on somebody else. And are they responsible? Well, then you would establish, well, how innocent are they in this? Did they just get lazy and they kind of put it off? Or were they purposely kind of getting out of the way? And then that brings us to great conspiracy theories like the 9/11 one, which, I believe in it. I mean, it seems to be pretty well established, and that there's enough official admissions from official sources about it that it seems to be real. And the reality of it seems to be that they just knew that an attack was coming, and not only did the American sort of military sort of leaders enforced a stand down, right? They just opened the gates, and they kind of helped in different sort of nation states. I think Iran was only involved, in Saudi Arabia was involved, and obviously the Bushes, and probably the Clintons, and who knows what, and so they just made it easy so that the attack happens, and then boom, you have 20 years of new foreign policy type of thing.
You believe in 9/11 conspiracy?
I do.
You're the one at the beginning that was like all anti-conspiracy.
No, I'm not all anti-conspiracy. To give context, I'm just skeptical of, I'm skeptical of the absurdity potential of conspiracy. Have that same mode of thought, and you can basically turn anything and anybody into a conspiracy theory. You can vilify anybody as being some sort of CIA agent, mole trying to sneak into your Bitcoin wallet or something, right? Like, you can always build that case, and so you have to have more standards to sort of sort the conspiracy theories. Otherwise, you end up in this sort of paranoid antisocial state where everybody potentially is out to fuck you, and that's not. I don't believe that doesn't make sense to me. And so
there's a really important distinction.
What are the standards?
Well, that's a good question.
So to explore those standards, I think there's a really important distinction here where, it sounds like, Juan, your default response is to say, I'm not going to necessarily believe a conspiracy unless, or suspect that it was a conspiracy unless I see evidence to support that. Whereas in the libertarian anarchist movement, it's quite often that we see
official story. So I'm not, but yeah.
Wait, what? I'm sorry. What? I didn't hear what you said.
And my position is skepticism to both the conspiracy and the official story. Like, I'm skeptical of both.
Okay, that's probably a good route. We definitely see in the libertarian anarchist movement the propensity for everyone on any story to just assume conspiracy. Now, personally, that's kind of like, if I don't have the time to go evaluate a story, which is like all the stories, because I just don't care about the news that much anymore. But it's kind of my assumption, like, yeah, probably some shady shit happened. There's probably some conspiracy. I'm not going to go out preaching, evangelizing for that position or anything. But if I'm just kind of like, well, what should I think about that? Probably conspiracy again. But then at the same time, Juan, I think you're also talking about, like, okay, in my personal life, how do we separate the difference between what we see in the news and maybe what is in my personal life, like something that affects me directly? And yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with you there that if we're going to think that there's some conspiracy happening against me personally by the people in my life, yeah, there's a really high standard of evidence that has to be met there to really believe that. But in terms of the news, like the mainstream, like I pretty much, like, to me, it's all bullshit.
Anthony, why?
So Anthony, go for it.
That's okay, go for it, Yifan.
Okay, well, I just want to touch on something Anthony said, which is that when you hear a report that's been given by the news media, and I suppose you could extend that to any non-partial source, there's this initial skepticism that you have because obviously the person who's giving that information may have ulterior motives. And you've identified that as a sort of conspiracy situation. I personally wouldn't. Like, I would say that in most situations, we all have different motivations, and because of those motivations, we may be inclined to exaggerate certain evidence and also neglect certain other pieces of evidence. So my question is, at what point does the kind of like obfuscation cross the threshold to be a conspiracy theory rather than like a biased account?
You know, I think that the people that report the news in sort of the inner circles of what we call, you know, the elite power players, certainly they have an interest in sort of writing in that gray area. How to, you know, is it just bias, right? Or are they actually part of some active conspiracy to cover up the truth? The reason that I sort of default to suspecting that they're generally in some kind of misinformation or disinformation campaign is because of my past research. I don't keep up with them anymore because I feel like that's kind of a distraction and a waste of time. But in the past, when I did keep up with them and I would go fact check them and do the research for myself, at pretty much every turn, every stone that was unturned, there they were representing some kind of lie, some kind of fabrication. Now, maybe the people actually that you see on the television screen, right, we could look at any individual person and say, well, maybe they don't know, maybe they're just a useful idiot, who knows. But the totality of the organizations and the other people that control the faces we see on the screen, just time and time and time, every single time, it was just clearly that they were doing some kind of disinformation. It doesn't mean that everything they say is a lie. It just means that anything that they say is like automatically, I have automatic skepticism for.
Yeah, and part of the trick of a good lie is you have to be able to have enough truth in there to bait people to pay attention and kind of believe it. So you pick like half of the truth that's convenient to you, you hide the part that's inconvenient, and then you add your narrative, and then you concoct the lie. And so that's an essential piece of it. If it's complete bullshit, people are like, it's complete bullshit, right? They see through it, or more easily.
I'm pretty radical about it. Like, you know, and I act this way in my personal life. If you're going to lie to me and I catch you in a lie once, well then why should I ever believe you again unless you come out, you apologize, and you make actionable steps to right those wrongs and to actually now, you know, gain that trust back and prove that you're trustworthy. And this was like, you know, my opinion throughout my whole life. And then 2016 comes around and I'm like, never really believed the media too much, but thought that, hey, maybe like there are some like good actors out there that really, you know, look for the truth and report on it. And we do see that in the alternative media now. But at that time in 2016, it just got so ridiculous and the whole fake news campaign spread. And that same situation, why should I believe you when in 2016 you came out and all of them, all Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and NPR, all of them came out and started like fabricating these ridiculous stories. And none of them have come out and apologized for it. None of them have stood up and said, wow, we were really wrong. We're going to really try to, you know, get back to good, honest journalism. We're going to, you know, wait until we have all of the facts before reporting on them. We're going to use at least 3 different sources and talk to you about those sources. And like, you know, there's whole anonymity for sources to protect them, but there should be some kind of, you know, reputational system. And maybe that's something that blockchain will help us solve. But there has to be some kind of reputation behind those sources to make sure that the information that they're getting and reporting back is accurate. But until they do that, I'm inclined to believe that everything that they say is probably a lie because historically they have proven that that is true. And I'm one of those people who continuously follows the truth as much as I can see it and as much as I can find it.
Yeah, I think in this highlights the importance of context in regards to the conspiracy theories. Like, we are in a time where lying for political reasons is like, what was it? One of the, like the ex-chief editor of Times Magazine, who used to work for the State Department or something like that, just went to some globalist sort of event and was like, yeah, no, I mean, people used to joke about, you know, call me the chief propagandist or something like that. And yeah, I mean, it's a job. Make like nation states use propaganda in their own people. Like, it's basically admitting that they use propaganda in their own people. And it makes perfect sense for people to have the default skeptical position of the official narrative on the establishment to show good faith and you know, prove intent, goodwill, and that's good. That's a good thing, you know. But I guess I lived among libertarians for so long that my role is libertarians, and so now I'm skeptical of libertarians. It's pretty funny. So.
This touches on something that Juan, you and I were discussing just a couple of days ago, and that's the burden of proof. Who owns the burden of proof? Generally, it's the person making a statement, right? If you're making a positive statement about something, trying to say, well, this is how it is, this is the reality of something, then typically you're going to own the burden of proof to validate that, hey, that's actually the case.
Wait, say it again. So say it again.
So it's the concept of burden of proof. Where do you place the burden of proof? So typically in a debate, there's two sides. Someone who's trying to support a case, trying to build a case, saying, okay, this is what happened, or this is the truth, or some version of it. And then on the opposite side is trying to say, okay, well, can we tear that down, right? And so burden of proof is really important when we're talking about really any pursuit of knowledge. And typically the party that owns the burden of proof, that's responsible for burden of proof, is the one making the statement. So like, for example, right now, I'm saying that, my statement is that if you're making a statement, you own the burden of proof. I would have to prove that, but I don't feel like proving that right now. It just seems intuitive.
Yeah.
I don't know if I like that actually, because it feels like that's almost like offloading. Like if I have a responsibility to try to like understand the world to the best of my ability, given the evidence that I'm presented with, then it seems like kind of putting that burden onto other people and be like, prove it to me, prove it to me. Like if someone makes a claim and I'm having like a discussion with them, then I'd want them to like try to substantiate their claims. But it's like, if they present me an argument and
well, the whole
it can't be only on the other person to like make the case, because like it's ultimately my responsibility to like evaluate the evidence I'm presented, to evaluate what's true and what's not true, what I believe and what I don't believe.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can take necessarily if they so wish, but legally and historically speaking, as far as I know, or as far as I understand, it's a defensive legal position that is not, it makes perfect sense because in the court of law, like if somebody accuses you of something, you used to have the pretense of, or the guilty until proven innocent. Innocent until proven guilty. Right, people supposed to be innocent to proven guilty, and that's designed for the unbiased, pure achievement of justice and the knowledge of justice and the settlement of justice, something like that. And puzzled in a sense, but at the same time, anybody can take on the burden of proof and try to make a case, whether or not it's the case against you. So it depends on the context too, but I think it's obviously a very important piece of communication.
I also noticed that in debates or, discussions these days, if you present a statement as an argument, somebody else doesn't really try to tear it down. They try to counteract it with their own arguments, right? So then you're presenting a statement and then the other person is presenting a different statement, and now has the burden of proof to convince the other person that their statement is the most true one.
Okay.
That's a really good point, because that sort of introduces a level of complexity where we're unable to analyze either one of the person's statements, because we keep shifting between, well, I'm trying to support my case while tearing down your case, and we sort of get divided and the statements get mixed up. A statement that I might make that's intended to doubting the case that the other person might make is now being used. Wait, no, that's not a good case for, you can't use that as an argument for your case. It's like, no, I was trying to tear down your argument. That wasn't the basis of my case. And so suddenly it starts getting really complex, and then we go down these rabbit trails and we get nowhere. So I always think it's a useful thing to say, okay, what's the thing we're analyzing? Who's trying to support that version of events or trying to support that statement? And then let's both play. Aren't there like it's not protagonist and antagonist? I think there's like some legal term for it, like the person that's
the prosecutor.
making the argument.
the defendant and the plaintiff?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In the legal system, that's what they are. In like just straight up debate, like debate club, there's some word for it. I can't think of what it is.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the same general game. Is there's somebody that makes a claim, a positive claim, and then somebody that's sort of criticizing, somebody that's defending it. And that makes sense when you take a position like, I don't know if that makes sense in all cases. Like, it depends. There's some conversations that are sort of so grand, or that they have some history that you can go back and forth playing both. I don't know. I mean, there might be some places where it breaks down, but in general, it's, you know, it's good. Anyway, yeah, burden of proof.
Okay, but like, maybe let's like, what I'm kind of wondering now is like, where is like the bedrock of things we can know? Because if we're gonna say like the mainstream media is like corrupt, and maybe we can like glean big things from them, like when they tell us that Donald Trump was elected, we can believe that maybe, but it's hard to know what to believe and what not to believe from the mainstream media. So that's let's say a compromised source of knowledge or evidence. And there's like scientific studies that are like published in journals, and it's like, can we believe those, or like, do we have to analyze those ourselves? And it's like is there any source of knowledge or information available to me other than like the events of my own life?
Mm-hmm. Well, on academia, on the academic game, it's really interesting. There's definitely, it depends on the topic. As far as my research of it, you know, obviously the social sciences are taking a lot of critique lately, and probably for a good reason. There's certain other, like, it depends on the journal too, right? Like, if you look into like the economics of the academic peer review process, and the actual volume of peer review that a lot of these papers go through, you know, you'll find some really horrifying numbers. Like there's some peer review is very, very shallow, and sometimes it like in the mathematics, for example, they have something called open source peer review, where mathematicians simply publish their academic papers on a blog called Xavier, XIVR, I think it is, and people do public open source peer review, and then that eventually makes it an academic journal, which there's a little business model behind it. Somebody's buying the paper, or it depends how it is, right? So that's an example to me of a process of knowledge acquisition or discovery that is pure and transparent, and it seems like the good faith is built into the process. And
I would like to offer a counter position to that.
Okay.
So basically and I don't understand that I understand some of the weaknesses of the argument I'm about to make. But basically, peer review is saying, okay, so a bunch of people agreed that it was cool, right? So it's popular. Isn't that just an appeal to popularity? Like, isn't peer review just ultimately a glorified appeal to popularity? So at the same time, right, like, we can't possibly, let's take blockchain, we can't all possibly know every white paper and every piece of code. So we kind of depend on each other for peer review. But at the same time, just because it's peer reviewed doesn't mean like that's not necessarily, it's a good way of maybe filtering things that aren't like aren't good ideas, but it definitely can't be the only thing that makes the case for why we believe something to be true.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting, just real quick. Interesting point in terms, for example, of the climate change science, or people that believe in that. I think Obama was like saying that the scientific consensus was that there's man-made climate change. And then some people, some philosophers and scientists were pointing out that there's no such thing as scientific consensus. In science, if one theory or one sort of revelation of facts trumps the popular consensus, then it's a unilateral set of change. Like, you know, if you have a fact that counters the theory, it doesn't matter how many people believe in the theory, you know, the theory falls. But for it to actually fall, people actually have to look at the evidence and conceive it. And so there is a sort of popularity layer of the whole thing. But also people could just be wrong for a long time. Like, you know, you look at the whole, you know, Earth is the center of the solar system. You know, Galileo discovered that wasn't the case, but people kept believing it for a few hundred years. Yeah, no, he was right, you know? So
Until now, when we're now back into flat Earth,
Yeah.
and now Earth is the center of the universe again, but now it's also flat.
it's actually not flat, it's donut shape.
Actually, solipsism says that I'm the center of the universe, so just so that you know.
How could we forget?
Arielle, you were asking, well, how do we know anything earlier? That kind of goes back even to a previous podcast where we're sort of discussing knowledge and what can we know and what does it mean, what is objective and what is subjective. And you were kind of saying something along the lines of, how can I know anything really outside of my personal experience to actually be true?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about that conversation because this kind of gets back to it. Like, it's like there's different theories about science, and like what Juan was talking about was like it connects to the paradigm theory of science, which is the idea that at any given time, science is operating on a certain paradigm, like a certain worldview or view of how that part of the world works, and scientists just like add little by little to that paradigm, and it's called normal science. So they're just incrementally making that worldview more robust, and something happens, like there's always some amount of evidence. Like no paradigm is perfect because it's just a model for the world, and eventually there'll be some contradiction within that paradigm. Like with Einstein, and like with the Newtonian model, the way that light was moved around the sun didn't quite make sense. And that was like just the little like wrinkle in the paradigm, and that little contradiction led to that paradigm being destroyed and replaced with a new one, which is like a paradigm shift when the paradigm is replaced. So and that connects kind of to the idea of falsifiability, which we talked about a little bit before. There's the idea that like it's way easier to disprove things than to prove things. Like it's not really clear how anything can be proven, but things can be disproven. Because all you need to disprove something is to find a contradiction within it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why science operates with the idea of the null hypothesis, the entire basis of the scientific method, is that you consistently disprove your null hypothesis, and it's like an indirect reinforcement of your hypothesis that you've made.
Can you give us an example of that, just to clarify more?
Well, sure. So like we'll say like you know, you all I'm assuming you all have a basic understanding of the scientific theory. So say you would, if you come up with a hypothesis, like a specific hypothesis, if we're talking about the behavioral sciences, you know, you might come up with a hypothesis such as, I believe creature X will respond in Y fashion to Z stimulus. And so that's your hypothesis. And then your null hypothesis is the opposite of that, is that you believe that creature X will not respond in with a Y response to the Z stimulus. And so you're looking to either confirm or not confirm that piece.
Like maybe an example would be gravity, right? We say, well, gravity means that everything falls towards the center of mass. So that would be our null hypothesis. We've set up a paradigm, and then if maybe we drop a particular, or we let go of an object and it falls the other direction, well, that would like basically counteract our null hypothesis and force us to reevaluate.
Well, no, that would prove your null hypothesis. Or sorry, it would not prove, it would confirm your null hypothesis. Your null hypothesis is what you do not expect to happen.
Fascinating.
Wait, no, I thought the null hypothesis was what we do expect to happen, right? Or we have a theory of gravity.
No, your hypothesis is what you expect to happen.
Yeah, the hypothesis is the positive claim, what you're expecting to happen. The null hypothesis is what should not happen. So if what should not happen happens, then that is indirect, contradicts your positive hypothesis.
I'm gonna look this up right now because I thought it was like exactly the opposite.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Here's what Google says. The hypothesis. Okay. So I just looked this up on Google. It's a statistical test. The hypothesis that there is no significant difference between specified populations, any observed difference being due to sampling or experimental error. Well, that doesn't necessarily help.
Well, it's a statistical trick, right? It's a statistical because the foundation of scientific statistics is that you have to prove, or you have to prove that something had a more than likely chance of happening due to the factor that you're varying, as opposed to like through random chance. So right, you flip a coin and it's either heads or tails, and there's a certain threshold above which you know, the random distribution of heads or tails, you're not going to get a certain ratio of heads to tails. And so the null hypothesis is based on that threshold, like your statistical threshold of when it's unlikely that something happened due to pure chance.
I just pulled this up on Wikipedia. It says the null hypothesis is a default position. That it's the default position that there is no relationship between two phenomena or between two groups. That it's okay. So the null hypothesis is generally assumed to be true until evidence indicates otherwise. In statistics, it's denoted as H sub 0. So yeah, the null hypothesis is supposed to be what we're presuming to be true, unless our experiment indicates that it's not. And it seems like it's generally related statistically to comparing two groups.
That kind of gets back to what we were talking about before with burden of proof, right? It's like if you're the one making a positive claim, then the burden of proof is on you to provide evidence for it. Whereas if you just have like so it's different than like a positive claim and just like a default kind of non-claim. Or is a claim that the positive claim is?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
It basically says, show me that the thing you said was going to happen didn't happen just through random chance. It happened because of the factor that you've varied.
Yeah, and that seems to be what science tries to do, is to stack, like if science is a process of trying to understand the nature of things, something like that, right? I think it's fair to say. And so in science, what they're trying to do is they find some truth, and then they see what the bounds of that truth is. And they try to build kind of like a Jenga structure. And then if somebody finds that one of those pieces, you know, falls, then the whole structure collapses, right? Or it can, or maybe, you know, I know I just butchered it, but in general, it's sort of like, you know, you're stacking evidence on top of evidence, right? But that's yeah.
The way I kind of see science is it's like, without science, all we have is our senses or other people's senses. So like what I see in the world and what Juan tells me he sees, and you can put it all together and try to come up with a worldview. But what science does is it allows me to sharpen my senses to far, far beyond what they would be otherwise. Like it's a powerful empirical tool because it provides a way to cut through the biases of my own senses, so I can see they have a truer and more pure empirical tool, and it allows me to see and hear, and to be provided with with far deeper evidence than I would have otherwise. But I mean, the issue is science is we still have the same theory making machines. We're no better at theory making than we were before science. It's the same. So we still need to take that evidence and make it into theories, and then there's the other layer of like disseminating that information into the world, and what happens when people start to like fudge numbers. Because it's like the scientific method itself.
Or when people misinterpret.
Yeah.
When? What did you say, Yifan?
Well, like when people misinterpret, like the kind of ubiquitous pop science and pop psychology articles that are all over the internet that collapse a complicated study down into like, you know, this factor causes this consequence.
Yeah.
Or even like interpreting other people's theories incorrectly, like all of Darwin's work, in my opinion, has just been butchered. Like he talks about evolution, and he talks about evolution within species, and he has all of this empirical evidence of these finches on an island that like evolve over time, and then somehow we get this idea of like people, like monkeys, turning into human beings, and the theory seems to break down, but people believe that that's the Crux's theory, which isn't necessarily true. And like he like wrote letters afterwards, like trying to clarify. because people were already taking his research out of context and applying it to in completely different ways than what he had really researched in his like narrow field and narrow experiments.
So they extrapolated, you're saying they took some observations he made, a theory that he came up with, and then sort of extrapolated far beyond what he originally intended to say.
Yeah, exactly.
And Anastasiya, what do you believe about that, like evolution? Because that's an interesting, I'm not sure I've heard that angle on criticizing Darwin before.
It's not so much criticizing Darwin, it's criticizing Darwin's fans, I guess. Like that's the thing. Well, I mean, there's research that our DNA is actually way closer to like rats and pigs than it is to monkeys. And even if we sort of kind of, well, okay, I mean, like we could look at it under a microscope, right? So, yeah, so like there's definitely like we can see experiential proof too that humans evolve and they become different, like right over time, like we adapt to our environment, just like the Finches and Darwin's research changed because of the food sources that they had around, and this happens naturally, progressively over time, just like how, you know, how dogs became like, or wolves became domesticated and started like having different behavioral patterns than their wild predecessors. But I think to say that there is one species out there and then over time it evolves and becomes a completely different species is a little bit far-fetched in my opinion, because I mean, if we look at the way that, you know, horses evolved and then we look at giraffes, you know, with their long legs, and they sort of kind of look like horses, but they're a completely different species. Well, it seems like the argument that some of the Darwin, like, I don't want to say supporters, because I think they're really twisting his theory, and they're saying that basically, like, horses could have possibly evolved into giraffes, but yet we see no intermediate species that has a neck that's longer than a horse's, but less long than a giraffe's. Just like I don't really think we've really found that many you know, like gorilla species that were gorillas, and then somehow there's like this animal or this creature that is somewhere between a gorilla and a human, and then all of a sudden we have a human. Like,
okay,
well, there is actually. Is that not what Australopithecus is supposed to be? Is that the link between the great apes and the humans?
so I think we have like there could be species that are very similar to each other, but I don't think that necessarily is a correlation that they evolved from like one place and then became something else. I am a little bit as well, so there's that.
I mean,
as long as we're discussing conspiracy theories, I think the origins of humanity is like one of the best conspiracies for us to discuss, because it's a scientific endeavor. I think there's a conspiracy to obscure, some people have the interest to obscure our actual historical origins. There's a whole lot of evidence about a lot of crazy stuff out there. So I'm kind of interested at this point, not so much to like try and break down any theories necessarily, like as in like oppose them, but I'm kind of curious to hear some stream of consciousness from you guys. Like, where do you think we came from? Like, if you had to guess, right? Obviously, knowing that you're not making a definitive statement, but like, where do you guys think we came from? Like, where do you think, like, are we aliens, right? Aliens seeded life onto the earth. Did we just evolve in a purely materialistic way? You know, what are the pyramids? Where is Atlantis, and why haven't we found it yet? Or have we found it, but it was hidden in Antarctica because the earth is flat or some shit? I don't know. Anyways, stream of consciousness. Anyone want to offer a theory?
So yeah, I've definitely been listening to a lot of Mark Cassie over the last couple of years, and I do think there's some really compelling evidence, like from the research that he's done from very old ancient Sumerian texts, etc., and the hieroglyphics and like all the pictures in ancient Egypt and whatnot, to kind of like I don't know, there seems to be like some evidence that maybe there were some kind of alien species down here, whether they're the Anunnaki or the aliens from like the Orion galaxy, that could have possibly come down here and had conducted experiments on to create humans in a way. So like Mark talks about how you know, how there's some texts that talk about this God, and even I think it kind of relates to the God in the Bible, because I don't know, it to me it seems the God in the Bible is a little bit bipolar. Like there is that aspect of source that seems intuitively very true to me, and then there's this like crazy vindictive creature that like creates all of this like negativity and chaos and death and destruction just because he may not like something or not agree with something, right? Like the whole debate about whether homosexuality is wrong or not. All the Christians say that the Bible says that it is, but then we look at the aspect of natural law, and as long as you're not hurting anybody, well, then you're not doing anything wrong. And if the great almighty source, you know, that we come from is all of a sudden nitpicking these, you know, tiny differences between us, then how much of a like a source God is he really?
And just to comment on that, there's Jordan Peterson has some analysis of that story, which is Sodom and Gomorrah. We were talking about it the other day. That's actually like his take on it is that it wasn't really about homosexuality. It was about the way that people were treating strangers, and the angels were strangers that were being harassed, and that is a bad sign of culture. Like that's a sign of cultural corruption, and maybe the city imploded. So there's different take on that story, and maybe there's some misinformation. That's what I believe anyway. There might be some misinterpretation of that story, but that's you know, just wanted to add that. But
yeah. So the alien thing, I also like. I've read a lot of Robert Monroe's work, and Robert Monroe was a natural astral traveler. He took a nap on his couch one day and woke up looking over his body. And he went really through the scientific method of trying to discover what was happening to him. He started going like with his, you know, doctor friends and psychiatrist friends, and they were all like, yo man, like you're crazy. Like you don't just like float above your body. Like that's death. That's how you die. And he was like, well, I'm not dead. So if you guys can't help me with this, then I guess I'm going to research it on my own. And he, you know, after every single one of his astral travelers, he would write it down in a journal. And the first book kind of just like is very, very mild. He just goes on all of these like adventures and kind of like sees what's out there and is like trying to figure out if he can see, like if it's actually real, if he can get out of his body and go to his neighbor's house and see what they have on their fridge, and then come back and then visit their neighbor's house, his neighbor's house in a physical form, and see that same thing on the fridge, right? So those kind of like little proofs. But then,
are you talking about? Did he write Astral Dynamics? Is that the book you're talking about?
No. So he wrote Journeys Out of the Body, and he wrote Our Journeys Out of the Body, and I'm totally forgetting the first one right now. But yeah, but basically about like it's his journey through the astral.
Did it match like that example?
Yeah, it absolutely matched. Yeah, and he would like. I think one of his first like experiments was going to his neighbor's house while he was, you know, in the astral, and hearing her talk to somebody else on the telephone. And then, you know, afterwards he would go there and be like, hey, like, did you have this conversation? And she was like really freaked out by it, because she was like, yeah, like, how did you know that? You know, and this is back in, I don't know, the 40s or 50s. So there was, you know, no Alexa or Siri spying on you, telling your neighbors what you're talking about. But so one of the most compelling things that I found, and I like read him when I was 15, and actually that was my first experience of struggling to believe in God, because the story goes that he goes on this adventure and he meets this like alien thought form that is traveling, you know, the galaxy, and Earth seems to be like a tourist destination spot to him. And he goes on this whole narrative that him and his other alien friend decide to go on this like tourist trip to go check out all these different planets. And they're on this bus, and they get to like the Earth's atmosphere, and the bus driver gives them like a little program and is like, here's Earth, and this is how Earth came about. This, you know, this great being decided that he was really lonely, and that he would come down and he saw this beautiful planet, and he decided that maybe he would try to build a garden there. And in this garden, he would create all of these different creatures, and, you know, because to collect this thing called loosh. And I'm still very, like, confused about what it is. It's some kind of like harvesting of energy or harvesting of maybe love or suffering or some kind of emotion that is very, very prevalent in human society. So it like talks about this whole creation story, but from perspective of it being this just like alien creature that didn't really have any care of what he was creating, but just really like experimenting with it. And I was like, wow, I was like, are we just really just a big experiment by this like alien thing?
And we certainly could, because we go and create gardens and they're like, yeah, that's pretty. I like the flowers.
Right.
I guess like for stuff like that, like I guess why should I believe it?
So right, like you think one account, and I think it's about credibility. Like when he set out on his journey, he really was trying to figure out what was happening to him. And I do believe that there are genuine people out there where they're credible sources because they do things intentionally, they do them patiently, very carefully, and they really try to look at all the angles. I mean, he wasn't just trying to like write a narrative. Something had happened in his life that he has never like seen before, and being kind of empirically minded, he tried to explain it and journal it as it was happening to him in the most honest way that he could.
So that's a really good sort of.
So
hang on, just real quick. It's a really interesting. That's a really interesting point or argument because, yeah, it may be that he was credible, and it may be that his experiences matched. And maybe, I don't know if we can verify those experiences because they're obviously internal, but if you go talk to a neighbor and then you have her account, right? One of the things that Nassim Taleb, who's a statistician that's pretty popular among the crypto people and just in markets in general, and like a critic, a skeptic of a lot of things, he has a statistical argument of success, which goes more or less like this. If you have enough players in a game, there's always a small but possible chance that somebody's going to get lucky 30 times in a row. And then most people around them will look at that person and be like, wow, how the fuck did you do it? You must be magic. What is your trick? Show me the science. And they'll basically form a cult following around them and try to dissect them. But statistically speaking, somebody will get lucky 30 times in a row. And it just could be complete luck. And,
so you're saying Robert got lucky 30 times or 100 times in a row?
Just lucky evidence, and that's why science tries to replicate experiments in multiple different contexts in order to counter that possibility. But yeah.
I don't know. What do you guys think of alien theories?
Well, hold on. Like the question was, what is the source of humans? Where do we come from?
Yeah.
So let's go through that stream of consciousness. That's fun.
Do you guys know about the stoned ape hypothesis?
The what?
Stoned ape hypothesis?
Yeah. Stoned ape. Oh yeah, that's a cool one. I like it. Oh, elucidate for us.
Yeah, it's the idea that we found like our pre-human ancestors found magic mushrooms and ate them, and that's why we have a higher cognition and language. That it caused like a mental great leap forward, so to speak.
And mushrooms don't seem to fit anywhere in the evolutionary kind of ecosystem, as far as I've heard. Like, there's no real they're a very different species than pretty much everything else. So there's people that believe that mushrooms are actually alien life forms that probably came through.
I've heard that one.
Yeah.
Just looking at mushrooms themselves, they're an incredibly interesting species of life. For example, mycelium network. So mycelium is the state that mushrooms are usually in. A mushroom is actually just the fruiting stage of the mycelium. Mycelium networks look very similar to neural networks. They look very similar to how brain cells connect to each other. The other thing is, in order for like the forest in general to sort of distribute nutrients, like let's suppose a cow dies in the forest, right? And there's nitrogen and all these like proteins and things like that. In order to distribute all the nutrients to everything throughout the forest in a way that life can continue, it requires these mycelium networks to move these nutrients. They literally take nutrients from one location and then move them to another. They do very interesting things, like there's mushrooms species that can break down petroleum and oil. They do very, very interesting things that no other species on Earth does, including, you know, I don't know, like consciousness, language. There's people out there, I can't remember his name. There's this guy, he calls himself the mushroom guy. He's got this hat that's made out of like old mushrooms. Maybe someone knows who he is.
Stamets. Yeah, I think his name's Stamets.
Paul Stamets.
Yeah.
Paul, yeah. And yeah, so he talks a little bit about how he used to have a stutter. He used to speak with a stutter. And that over the course of sort of years of dosing himself with psychedelic mushrooms, that his stutter started to go away, and that he became very, I don't know, eloquent, or, you know, able to speak like a normal person. Thought that was a pretty cool, because definitely, like, I mean, definitely my language cognition has changed as a result of psychedelic experiences, for sure.
Can you elaborate on that?
Maybe. Yeah, I guess.
Well, obviously, you talked about how you're learning Russian right now. Do you think that, like, taking psychedelics, especially like mushrooms, has actually helped you be able to learn a language? Because, you know, like, research shows that it's a lot harder to learn a new language as you age, right? It's really easy for little children to pick it up, but the older you get, the more difficult it is to, like, memorize these new vocabularies and really communicate with people on that fluent level. So do you think that psychedelics have kind of helped you on your journey to be able to learn new languages?
I would definitely say most likely, yeah. And definitely one thing, it's helped to be able to verbalize abstractions. When you experience things like hearing colors and smelling sounds, what do they call that? Synesthesia? There's a term for it where you, definitely those kinds of experiences, for me personally, have helped to be able to put language onto what was otherwise like a very abstract kind of experience. And I definitely, it's hard to say, like, okay, so, you know, I study, I self-observe, I try to get better at stuff. So have I gotten better at language because, you know, that's just the natural course of things? Have mushrooms or, you know, psychedelics, have they helped me? I would definitely say it seems to be the case, right? There's a lot of correlations there that you could say, well, it was because of that and not because of psychedelics, you damn hippie. But I definitely think personally that it was a pretty big factor. Starting with marijuana, right? That's one of the lowest, sort of lowest level psychedelics, and that's, you know, it was marijuana that really piqued my interest in higher level experiences. I'm still interested in taking like a straight up like DMT trip. I think that'd be pretty cool. Done ayahuasca, salvia, mushrooms, acid, right? A few different things. I try not to like just do them haphazardly. I think you get a lot out of those experiences if you approach them consciously, if you approach them with intent. But I mean, it's also fun to party. So anyone else feel like psychedelics have? Oh shit! As long as we're on the topic, so when I first started smoking weed, definitely like I play guitar a little bit, and like timing, when I first started, like rhythm and timing was a really difficult thing for me to do. And smoking weed just kind of like, I think everyone that smoked weed knows like your concept of time, really any psychedelics start messing with your concepts of time. And it helped me quite a lot to develop better rhythm and guitar. And I was able to take that back right when I wasn't stoned and actually like do that in a sober reality. So I definitely think there's, you know, your mind, it changes. The first couple times I took mushrooms, the way people would ask me, well, what was it like? I'd say, okay, you ever seen those 1950s movies where they're like, the operator's like, hello, who would you like to talk to? And she's like changing the plugs, you know? Like mushrooms is kind of like unplugging a bunch of those and then just plugging them in different places in your mind. And it's being able to take those experiences and sort of reprogram your brain is definitely a useful thing, I think. But only if you're approaching it from a responsible perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things that psychedelics do, and like that I saw like from my personal experience, is giving you like a broader ability for pattern recognition, right? I think at the core of what they do is they exactly like how you say that, and exactly how it brings back to music and language, and it's really just pattern recognition, and I think it's like growing your awareness of the patterns around you. And maybe half of that is just your own like spiritual journey and spiritual progression. But I think psychedelics can sometimes really accelerate that. I've noticed that I'm much more aware of patterns within my life, and that I can see how natural law plays into everything, and I can see how like karma plays into it, and how experiences correlate and connect to each other through like really long periods of time. Even from my childhood, I can be like, oh wait, I'm like, this experience that I'm having is related to that experience from way back when. And now I can see that pattern. And I think part of why I can see that pattern now is because my consciousness has expanded through these different substances and these different perspectives of reality that are different from your sober perspective of reality. So you can just like, you know, like do all of these different, gain all of these different perspectives of reality through all of these different ways.
And there seems to be that psychedelics actually change your openness personality trait, right? I mean, that Jordan Peterson has talked about that apparently it actually like moves you a full sort of standard deviation and openness, which is really interesting. Like that's one of the reasons that I haven't done ayahuasca or haven't done like San Pedro or those, because I'm already pretty open-minded and I feel like I don't want to open myself too much. There's a really funny joke by Tim Minchin that if you open your mind too much, your brain falls out.
Yeah, it's, I was kind of thinking that like while Anastasiya was talking, because it's like, if you look at the mechanism in your brain, like a brain that's on acid or something, it's or on a psychedelic, it's like, you look at like a normal brain, there's like a little like red like pattern of activity moving along it. When it's on like a psychedelic drug, like the whole thing is like lit up, like there's so much brain activity, because it's like it just is literally more connected than usual. So you are like on a very literal level, like making all kinds of connections that you wouldn't usually be making, which is like, I think why you feel so like, I mean, who knows which way the causality goes, but it's like that's associated like with that feeling of like creativity and openness and like greater insight and pattern matching. But there is a danger to it. Like Juan was saying, like I was thinking like it's why it's like dangerous for people who are of a tendency towards schizophrenia to take psychedelics, because it's like too much pattern matching. Like when it gets like pathological, like the paranoia, like if you're in a coffee shop and it's like, oh, like that guy, like the way he's tapping the table is like sending a signal to someone who's like, you know,
right.
I guess who's like the
triggers. So if you already have a predisposition, like genetically, to have schizophrenia in your family, if you take the psychedelic really early on, that could be the literal trigger point for the schizophrenia to start presenting itself.
Yeah, it kind of does the exact thing. It's funny. It's like some people say that like schizophrenia is like it's like a creative mind that goes out of control in a way. They say like creative people, it's like associated with creativity, like the genes that cause schizophrenia.
I think it has to do with actual spiritual gifts, but like that, like for whatever reason, you are able to connect to that like astral place or whatever you want to call it, but you're not able to process it in this life with like the physicalities that you have for whatever reason. It's like, it's almost like schizophrenics are like hearing voices and talking to somebody, and regular like physical science hasn't been able to explain why or how. But from a spiritual aspect of like people who are psychic and who do talk to their spirit guides or connect with like nature spirits or whatever, and hear those voices in those ways. Because like you can hear voices and they could tell you to do really terrible things, and you could go out and do those really terrible things, or you can hear voices and they can actually help you, and like people have experienced both. So I think schizophrenia is that place where maybe you're not able to handle that influx of information for whatever reason. But that's like my own working theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of two ways of looking at it. Like either that it comes from the inside or that it comes from the outside. Like, as it's like, it seems like sometimes when people end up with like those kinds of pathologies, it's like like the voice they hear is like related to something that happened when they were a kid or to some anxiety. So that's kind of an argument for like the internal it's coming in from inside and to the conscious mind. But there seems to be an element that's, it could be external too.
Right.
This idea that it's more like a demonic or some kind of transmission that can't be dealt with properly.
And I've seen both. Like I've met people both, like people who are schizophrenic and seem to have those external influences over their life, and those external influences have actually like transferred to like people in my life that were like close to that one person. And then I've met people who it's almost like an internal guidance, right? Where they still hear voices, but they're completely functional, and it actually is extremely helpful and beneficial to their life to be able to connect with these spirits is really the best like word I can use.
Yeah, and I wanna like illuminate that word, because it's a word that's like I was an atheist for a long time, like 10 years. And so when I hear the word spirit, there's a part of me that's like
woo hippie stuff.
Woo hippie stuff that might not mean anything. But where I'm at now is sort of like there are certain meta patterns, like there's certain concepts that are so fundamental in a sense that they emerge in a variety of different things, right? And they are both within the mind and within the physical experience, and they're also outside of us. And maybe maybe it's schizophrenia. I mean, I don't know. We're totally kind of talking stream of consciousness here, but it could be a combination. It could be like a hyper focus of like the patterns. Anyway,
It sounds like you're talking about informational constructs. Like, so it sounds like you're kind of talking about informational constructs. Like, so for you, the idea of a spirit is sort of this informational construct. Like you could say the spirit of love, kindness, or the spirit of, I don't know, anything really.
Information, because like in information theory, we have information, and then and that's to some degree it's dependent on the observer who is observing the information, and that the information itself is kind of in a cyber state. It's sort of like it's a different realm in a sense than the material machine from which the information emerges and where it's stored, but they're both interconnected. So the electromagnetic sort of metal things in the computer have an actual shape that is actually matched to the information, and then the information rises and then moves, right? And so kind of stuff, but they're both, there is a binding point where those two are interconnected. And so it's not just information, there's also, it has a material or a physical shape. But
it's kind of like light exists in this light exists in a sort of quantum superposition of being both a wave and a particle simultaneously. And then you have these crazy like double slit experiments where it behaves really weirdly, and it depends how it behaves, depends on if it's being observed or not. So it's like information almost exists in this sort of ethereal realm that's hard to even pinpoint, like where does it exist and how does it exist? What's the nature of its existence?
Yeah, because I look at humans, I mean, humans are like kind of like supercomputers. Like we're just this incredible thing that just, we can simulate reality. Sometimes, and then sometimes we do like metaphorical sort of simulations that are true but counter logical to the normal laws of physics, right? So when you're dreaming, you're tripping balls and it doesn't make any sense. You look at a metaphorical and then it starts making sense, and there's a lot of psychoanalysis that can be done in dreaming. And so we're just these incredible machines that can simulate the future. And one of the theories why we can do that is because it helps us play out games in our mind at low cost, so that we can prepare for real world potential games that we might have to play and deal with, and that will have serious costs in our life. So anyway, so that's part of the realm where information exists. So and that is the observer in the back of our mind. You know, the hippies would say the third eye and the amygdala, which does seem to be where the source of dream state. Like we have like an actual, it's like a DMT machine where you're tripping on DMT, and that's in your amygdala. Oh, sorry, your pineal gland. Amygdala is where emotional sort of that's where the emotions happen. The amygdala, right? It's the pineal gland.
We could even take it a few steps further. So there's this new thing called quantum computing, quantum supercomputing.
Right.
And the truth is it's these machines that do these insane calculations that would otherwise be completely impossible for our current normal computers like your desktop. And the truth is we don't actually know how it is they're doing what they're doing exactly. Like, we have some ideas, we have some theories, but we really, everything that's occurring when these functions are being evaluated is sort of beyond this event horizon. The same concept of if you try to measure what's happening, you're disturbing the process, and you'll screw the whole process up just by observing it. So we can't even observe what's happening underneath this event horizon. And then eventually it spits out an answer, which is a probabilistic answer, but it's usually like extremely accurate. And it's also far beyond like what we possibly could imagine was possible. So if we can extend that to our own brains, our own hardware and machinery, it seems very likely that our brains are some sort of quantum computer, quantum supercomputer. It sort of gives rise for the possibility for us to have the ability to do insanely, insane calculations in our sleep, in our head, to perceive things happening in the future before they even happen, right? We can like really we can start from the spectrum of physicalist, like just completely materialistic, and then start building further and further and farther until it's like, wow, we're pretty far in woo-woo spiritual land here, but we do have some theorized mechanisms for how we can bridge that gap.
Do you know, have you heard of hyperbolic discounting?
Hyperbolic what?
Hyperbolic discounting.
Mm-mm.
It's like in terms of like predicting the future. Because like when you first said that, my thought is like, we kind of do predict the future. Like we are really good at predicting the future. Even like with our instinctually, like when we're in a situation and we get a bad feeling, like that's like using rapid calculations to predict the future, at least from one way of looking at it. Like hyperbolic discounting is the idea that like there's like a curve where like because the future branches out so quickly into possibilities, like every second there's like so many possible there's so many, like the future like bifurcates so quickly that when you try to predict something that's like a distance into the future, it becomes really hard to do because you don't know which of any possible future you'll end up in. So our brains are designed for only predicting things that happen very close into the future, or for only being able to focus on things in the short term. So something that's like the present is certain, and something that's like 5 seconds in advance is very likely. Whereas like something like, so the idea is that like our brains are designed to put a ton of calculation into trying to predict what's about to happen in the immediate future, and aren't very good at predicting long term.
I feel like there's a capability in our brains, and I feel like I occasionally tap into it, but I'm not good at tapping into it. But occasionally I have, and it sort of enables observations, predictions, and abilities that would seemingly go beyond what like traditional science would say is even possible, right? Traditional science wouldn't say it's possible for you to dream your future. It wouldn't say it's possible for you to call dice, or do anything like that, read thoughts, right? They'd say, yeah, well, they don't have a whole lot of mechanisms for that. But at the same time, I feel like, I personally have experienced too many, what people would say call paranormal, supernatural things. I've experienced far too many supernatural things in my own personal life that, from my scientific perspective as an engineer, as a studier of the natural universe, that from our current paradigms would be impossible. So what it does is it leaves me in this place where I have to start searching outside of the paradigm for explanations for how it could be possible. And it's interesting because you don't actually have to go that far, and you don't have to like reject too many things. You don't have to get super conspiratorial about it. You just sort of have to take all the evidence, the information that's the experiments that have been done, and just interpret them just a little bit differently. Just see a few different layers, a little bit, maybe a couple layers deeper, and suddenly there's this huge realm of possibility that takes it from being like this kind of God, woo-woo, spiritual crazy stuff into something that's like, oh no, like that's totally possible. There's an explanatory mechanism for how that even could be possible.
Rational, and if you can see that it's logical and rational, then you can get over that kind of like fear of, what if this is crazy, like this is magical, it doesn't make any sense. And one of my favorite quotes is like, if you don't believe in magic, you will never find it. Right? So it's like only if you look for those things and look at those perspectives, then you can kind of start seeing it. And also, my other favorite quote is, magic is really just science that we don't understand yet.
Yeah.
So it's explaining the same thing just in different terms and just using different tools, because we don't just have our five senses, right? We have, like, we all like collectively understand that we have something called intuition. We all collectively agree that we have something called a conscience, which is different from a consciousness, right? So we have these tools that are kind of less less explainable by science in our like modern, you know,
Current scientific.
current scientific paradigm. But we know that we have these tools that are exposable, and just like you said, Arielle, like sometimes we get a bad feeling before something happens. And really, we don't know how that happens. Like maybe our brain does calculate these like crazy, you know, mathematical equations to figure out that yes, with these probabilities that are all around us that we're seeing and connecting with, something could be coming that want to.
Yeah, we've had a really interesting experience with Anthony the other day. We were driving, and there was I think Anthony was sort of talking about, something police, and then it was like, oh no, I manifested it now, and then literally go over a little mountain, like a little bridge, and boom, we see a cop car, like with lights on, like, you know, few blocks forward. And it's like, okay, did you just manifest that, or did you intuit it? Was it that intuited it? And then now became the word intuited it. And
it can be both.
How do we?
In fact, particle wave duality sort of implies that it's both.
Right. Even the particle, right?
It's pretty hard to know, like, you know.
Chicken or the egg.
This is I don't know. Do you guys know Robert Anton Wilson, the writer?
No.
I heard towards intuition, by the way.
Yeah, I think I've told you about him, Juan, but yeah, he's really great. And I was reading one of his books, and I had this exercise that I was practicing for a while, which was I would just go around my daily business, but I would take note whenever I find a quarter. So just do that for a while. And it is each quarter, you're supposed to change your paradigm. So at first you start with the paradigm of I'm finding quarters because I'm paying more attention and I'm being more conscious. And then once you find a quarter, you switch to the paradigm of I'm finding quarters because I'm calling them in through synchronicity, because I'm putting the message out there into the universe, and the universe is presenting me with quarters. So the idea is to keep switching your paradigm, so eventually you're able to see both, to instead of just believing in one or the other, you become aware of like your own beliefs, and you're able to more navigate through them.
Yeah, it's really.
We had similar to the thing the story you told, Juan, on the highway. So we went sailing a few days ago, and the wind was kind of light. It was taking a lot longer to get to the point that we were trying to get to. And so we were joking, and we're kind of like laying around. There's not much to do. We're just, you know, soaking in the sun. And we said, you know what, let's everyone focus on some wind. Let's manifest some wind, right? Everyone focus on it being windy. So we did it just for fun. And then like 15 minutes later, or maybe 30 minutes later, the guy driving the boat's like, hey guys, there's a water spout over there. Check out the water spouts. We're like, hey, oh shit. Hey guys, remember that time we tried to manifest some wind and then we got like water spouts accidentally? Be careful what you manifest. You just might get it.
Yeah, and those who don't know what a water spout is, because I didn't know what a water spout was. It's like a tornado coming out from the clouds into the water, and I don't know if it sucks up the water from the ocean or what the hell it was. It's basically like a tornado in the ocean.
It's a little like miniature tornado. So it happens because the air is rising. So like normally tornadoes require a huge, massive anvil-shaped thunderstorm to develop, and they're really, really powerful. Water spouts are more like a tropical phenomenon where you have all this rising air, or really water vapor, over the ocean. And one of the most efficient ways to move things is in a funnel, right? Like you pull the plug on your bathtub and it starts this naturally a funnel action to drain your bathtub. Same thing happens in nature. So it develops this little funnel, and it's usually associated with like thunderstorms, but not like huge, heavy, ridiculous thunderstorms, just light thunderstorms. So anyways, it's a suction action where it's pulling that water up into the clouds. But yeah, I'd never seen one before. It was freaking awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah. Pretty far away, but it's cool. And the guy said he had been in one of his sailing trips, he had seen a ship get hit by one of them and basically just took down the mast. And then he had also sort of been like, 30, 40, 50 feet from one and another one over there as he was sort of, coasting through under a cloud formation. Yeah. There's experiences
So
like
I
that.
want to
Report. Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to touch on something that we talked about earlier. So, like you guys are telling all these stories about like, I guess this idea that you can manifest something, and it just made me think of earlier in our conversation that talk of the burden of proof. So like, I wonder, like, from in your guys' personal experience, like, what is the thing that allows you to say this, and like, and for you to know that it constitutes like a legitimate piece of knowledge? Like, we talked about it in theory earlier, but now it's something that you're practicing. And so I'm curious, like, how do your theories work with your practice?
I mean, I practice it for fun, just for shits and giggles.
Okay.
I say, like,
so you're not saying that it does necessarily constitute true knowledge. It's like, for you it's like a form of kind of like philosophical recreation a bit.
Well, I think I think people say things and they might not understand the mechanisms for them, and I believe that the mechanisms are there's probably some sort of chain reaction that is happening from source towards your immediate impact zone, like your field of influence. Like, that's the manifestation that I actually believe can happen. However, there is sort of situations where, I don't know if you've ever had anything like this, but maybe something like you're in a kind of something critical is happening in your life and you're having a very important sort of decision moment, conversation with somebody, and suddenly like an animal shows up. And it's like, there's something weird about the animal, right? Like, and the people tell stories like this, or the weather, like suddenly like a light rain happens, like just perfect. And it could just be coincidence, but yeah, part of the dilemma is that, the universe is infinitely complex and we don't understand the fundamentals well enough. All we can do is sort of, archetype and build knowledge structures, and they get our own sense of the elephant or whatever. But anyway, that's more or less where I stand on it. It's like, anyway, just leave it at that.
I have a couple of examples, I guess. Like, so one of my most powerful manifestations was actually very recently. So I manifested my new job with Nexus. And the way that I did that is I got into the crypto sphere, and I was really excited and passionate about blockchain technology and Bitcoin and like the community and the principles and all of these things. And I was like, for the first time in my life, I was like, this is something that I actually want to do. This is something that I could see waking up every morning and working on, and, not being miserable about it. So, I went to the Nexus conference, and I, told Colin that I wanted to be Nexus girl, and I was really excited about it. I was like, I'm going to promote this cryptocurrency. I'm going to like talk about this blockchain and educate people on it. And then I also so I started focusing on it and becoming more aware of it, and putting more of my like energetics into it through my passion, through my emotion, through my thoughts, and then also taking the action step of volunteering in the community, actually doing the work, doing things like writing the FAQs, providing content, doing interviews, etc. And then eventually, like when it felt like the time was right for whatever reason, I finally got all my stuff together and I applied for the position. And so I manifested it all the way from the energetics and the passion all the way to actually having this job in the physical. So to me, manifestation isn't just the act of like thinking about it and it's going to happen. That's a lot of that new age bullshit that people are just like, if I meditate all day, then these things will come into my life. But it's not. all the components playing together, and then the action step is the thing that actually gets you to that manifestation. So just like Arielle was saying, you're becoming more aware of the quarters, right? But you actually have to stop and pick up the quarter and be like, oh my gosh, yes, and then connect it to that point where you decided that you were going to become more aware of it. So yeah.
Okay, so basically for you, you include like your actions in the physical realm as part of this idea of manifesting. Like it's not limited to this like metaphysical realm.
Right. Yeah, no, it's not. Like, and another example that I'm like thinking of that's happened recently is I've been researching organizational structures, decentralized and distributed organizational structures. So because I'm researching it and I'm thinking about it and I'm like bringing it up to other people, right? I get more and more information from all of these different people. But then there was a moment where I was talking to somebody and they had randomly brought up this idea of decentralized and distributed systems without me even vocalizing it to them. So I see that as like manifesting that synchronicity of meeting somebody that has a piece of information that I'm already aware of and looking for, and just seeing that pattern emerge of like, yes, I'm thinking about this, and now this other person is bringing it up because they have something to share to me. And I think because we're all interconnected, there is a space, like what I call it is the information field. Some people call it the Akashic records. It's kind of like a mycelium network, or like the way that trees communicate through their like root neuron system, and the way that our brains function with our neuron systems, and the way that like I think energetics work in space too. So like one of the ways I think we see patterns is if you can see something in the macro and you can see the same exact pattern in the micro, and you see that pattern reflected in all of the areas in between, that is probably something that we can call truth, right? Because it repeats over and over again in different variations. So from that perspective, being able to connecting those patterns through different people and manifesting it that way too, of like finding the connections and being aware of those connections as they come your way.
And it's a positive feedback. So you start thinking about it, you start manifesting, you start talking to social media, you start networking, you start talking, you express, you end up meeting the right people, which takes you to the right meetup, which takes you to the right people.
Which creates the right group, and then you start working together, and then you start bringing that mission to life, and that to me is the process of manifestation. Yeah,
and the kind of philosophical dilemma there is, are we manifesting things outside of our field of influence, or in other terms, is our field of influence much wider than would be reasonably defined, let's say, or is it something like, because I could make the argument that it's simply like it's an effect of compounded interest on making the proper decision, and that stuff accumulates very fast. And that's not my argument, but I've heard it, and
it seems like there's a few distinctions it seems like it's important to make. Like there's like the actual event itself of like a positive, like putting out a positive intention, having a positive thing happen, which is kind of indisputable that happens. Like it can happen that I like decide today I want to go out and find a quarter on the ground, and I find one. Like that is an event. Like those kinds of events happen. So that's like an event. And then there's like the different interpretations we're putting on that event. So I can interpret that as a coincidence. I can interpret that as I was like scanning the ground, obviously, because I had this intention. So my behavior was different. So the outcome was different. And there's an interpretation of there's a supernatural, there's some force I don't understand that connected me with that quarter because I had that mental event. So there's like, I think that what Yifan's question was getting at is like, how do you justify the metaphysical or the supernatural explanation?
Statistics. So to go with the quarter example, let's suppose that there's like a really rare quarter from like, I don't know, say 1939 or something. It was like a misprint. Like occasionally they have quarters and pennies that are misprints. Like there's like a few thousand of them that they made a mistake and there's a few left in circulation. It's extremely unlikely to find them, like millions and millions of chances to one to find one, right? So I think one of the ways we could judge something like that is to say, okay, how statistically unlikely is it for me to be able to put a specific idea into my head, manifest it, and then I found like that particular quarter that I was manifesting, right? And then hypothetically, maybe we could do that again and again and again. And certainly we could say that, well, in an infinite universe, everything is statistically bound to happen eventually, including you manifesting your quarters in front of you seemingly when it was only just chance. But that's really hard to sort of argue against your own personal experience when you find that you can do that, right? Does that make sense?
That's kind of why we have the scientific method, though, is because there's like confirmation bias. Like with the science, like if you're going to do it scientifically, you'd have to note in your head every time you have a desire or an intention, and every time it doesn't work out. I can look back and probably remember times where really weird things happened, where I was like putting out an intention and it happened, and it was like, whoa. But I don't really note all the times where I'm like, oh, I wish this happened and nothing happens, right? So it's like it's hard to actually gather statistics, because it's like what represents each individual thought event, and like it's like thoughts aren't like divided into like discrete intentions. It's just like a continual stream of like mess in your head. So I guess my question is like, how do you deal with confirmation bias?
Is the
that's a very good point. Very good point.
Happen randomly? Is that a counter argument, like manifestation, and for the justification of the metaphysical is that things just happen randomly and they have no order to them?
I'm kind of agnostic as to this question, but I think the counter argument would be more that if you put out an intention or something, if you put out an intention, your behavior is changing, which makes it more likely for it to happen. I think would be the more like that'd be one counter position. Another counter position would be that it's just random.
Well, and it can be both. Like it can be look at it like there's the individual, and then there's their field of influence, and then there's the field in which they don't have influence. And within their field of influence, their manifestation is immediate and to some degree causal, or a high correlation, like they're actually putting pieces into play. And then outside of their field of influence, there might be coincidences that help or hamper. But then there might be like a deeper layer that we're not aware of, where if you are embodying a particular sort of meta pattern, then like one of these patterns that's sort of built into the cosmos, if you will, right? Like the triangle, right? Just to pick something that I don't even know how I'm going to align it physically, but if you're embodying a particular sort of meta pattern, then maybe that attracts that moves other things into alignment. Who knows, right?
Because everything's vibration, right?
Well, there's fractals, right? Like there's a lot of fractal phenomena in nature, and again, it shows up at there's patterns that show up in multiple layers of existence. So that's a possibility that I believe in. That it seems to me like it's plausible. But again, how do you prove it? I don't know, right? And so it's more of a sort of,
I mean,
it's even hard to define. But
Wiccans do this. I practiced a little bit of Wicca back in the day, and they're all about that manifesting part too. And what they do is like with candle magic, what you do is you create a ritual. And that ritual has your intention behind it, and basically you are the creator of your power. You're the magician. You're the one who makes things happen, because we have the free will to make things happen. And so when you do a candle magic ritual, you embody like those things with this intention, and then the elements, the earth, water, air, and fire specifically, bring in those energies. You basically put out that intention in the universe, and through these physical objects that move, because air, water, earth, and fire all are moving elements. Those moving elements kind of bring those vibrations and those energies back to you, which doesn't necessarily manifest the magic, but it opens up sources of energy that then you can draw from to actually create these things in the physical. And they have been doing this through their religious practice for centuries and centuries. So, I mean, like, who am I to say that it doesn't work if they've been doing this for so long and are seeing the results of it in their covens and in their families and in their, you know, in their lives in general as individuals and in groups, that these things do actually work the way that they work because they're getting the positive results that they set out to get through these rituals.
Well, my skepticism would be similar to my skepticism of infinite energy technology. Like some people believe in infinite energy technology, like some machine that can produce, you know, vast amounts of energy for very, very little cost, and they harness the electromagnetics of whatever. And it's actually like in Atlas Shrugged, John Galt, that's the machine that he creates. He creates a static electricity fountain of energy machine thing, right? But the funny thing is, like, if anybody discovers that, the first thing that would be rational to do would be to put it in a Bitcoin mining rig and start creating Bitcoin like a motherfucker and completely dominate the market, because you have zero electricity, infinite zero electricity. You can scale forever and just completely dominate. And
I don't know. I think that's kind of narrow. Like for one, you would need all the ASICs to do it, right? You would need the actual hardware to couple that energy to. So, but then if you actually invented an infinite energy machine, like would Bitcoin be like the first thing on your mind? Like it definitely wouldn't be the first thing on my mind.
It would be one of the first things on my mind. And I think what I would look for
You
is
would
like,
need Bitcoin.
because anything that you want to do, the more Bitcoin that you have, the more effective you are at it. So it's like, why wouldn't you, you know?
The Holy Grail.
I mean,
Yeah.
I guess that's one of the uses I would probably, you know, I'd probably use it for that a little bit, sure, but not just that.
Greed, whether we like it or not, is pretty reliable. pretty humans are, it's one of the motivations that shows up quite a bit.
So, okay, so one of the things that I like to speculate about is currency, the nature of the relationship between currency and energy. One of the things that happened in the 1970s when we went completely off the gold standard was we replaced that with a connection between our currency and oil, right? We had the petrodollar, which was a brilliant piece of maneuvering by the deep state, because in a very real way, currency is the energy of the economy. To phrase it in sort of an SAT question, you could say that matter is to energy as capital is to currency, right? If you have matter with no energy, it doesn't do anything. It's lifeless. It practically doesn't exist. There's nothing happening. In the same way, capital without currency, there's no way to exchange capital. There's or at least it's very, very limited. So currency is sort of the energetic nature of a capitalist, I don't want to call it system, but for lack of a better term at this point, yeah, we need currency so that capital can interact, move, grow, transform, and change.
It seems like we almost have the opposite situation in our society, or our society, or like, yeah, I guess the North American society, of like, there's a lot of currency, but like the productive base is gone. So a lot of the capital is kind of imaginary capital based off of like sort of financial games and like gambling, like the whole derivative kind of thing.
Yeah, like the stock market, the notional value of a company.
Yeah, like a debt-based capital instead of production-based capital.
I have a theory as to why the American financial system hasn't collapsed despite libertarians predicting it for about 50 years. That's really entertaining.
Go on.
The theory is basically that the source of wealth is innovation for the purpose of time efficiency. So everybody's just trying to do what they want to do faster, and so they innovate to do that, in turn saving time and achieving more faster. And that's the creation of wealth, is sort of that's the fundamental, or one of the fundamental. Well, that my theory. Let's just make it a singular cost theory. That would be kind of like one, if the fundamental piece. And so what the Federal Reserve does is they inflate at a smaller rate than we innovate efficiency. And so as long as they stay under the innovation ratio, they can keep inflating forever. And that's why the economy hasn't collapsed. The moment that they overshoot that, the system gets constrained and bottlenecked and maybe splits or whatever. So anyway.
Well, I think that has happened in a lot of cases. So one, I think that these guys do actually have a lot of these economic realities sort of modeled and with mathematical models created to define and predict what's going on. Right? They don't share that with us, the general population, but I think we do see where they overheat the system, they run it too hard, too fast, and then we have, 2008 style collapses. I think they know exactly what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that also ties into the subjective theory of value, and like the point that they do hide a lot of this information from us, and really the general population knows nothing about how the Federal Reserve works. They don't even realize like what the Federal Reserve is at its basic levels, not even to talk about how the monetary system works and how the economy functions. But really, at its core, we talk about the reason that currency becomes valuable is that people believe in that currency. So I think one of the other aspects of the collapse not happening is that the majority of the population is so indoctrinated that everything is working perfectly smoothly the way it should be, even though we have, pretty clear and evident truth all around us that some systems are absolutely definitely broken because we see people suffering because of those systems. I think one of the reasons that it hasn't really collapsed is also because people believe that it's perfectly fine and it should be functioning the way it's functioning. At least until everybody starts believing in Bitcoin. And I think that's the power right there of like changing that mentality into a new system as much as changing the actual like physical currency into Bitcoin as we buy it.
So I'm not sure I understand that. So do you think there can be a system that everybody believes in, but that still like collapses or is like non-functional in a major way?
I don't know. Can we think of a system that people stop believing in that collapsed versus not?
Well, Congress approval in the United States is like 6%. It's still going, and same for mainstream media approval, and they're still going. So you can have the Pareto. The Pareto is a natural law of distribution that seems to happen pretty much everywhere, where 4% of the players in a particular set that you define are responsible for the output of about 40% of the total group. And the definition of the group is multidimensional. So you can look for the Pareto in music, and it's like a small set, but they are dependent on the Pareto of musical engineering, which is a different set, who are dependent on the Pareto of internet communications for publishing on a different set, right? So there's a multidimensional sort of statistic or kind of thing, but what could happen is just the Pareto particular industry are just on the mainstream media for, against the will of the people and against falling ratings and against all this stuff, and that's why they get to keep playing this silly game. It's a losing game, a losing battle, but I guess, maybe they think that there's some benefit in it. No, right? Anyway, not to get too much into politics.
I would say to your point though, like that Congress's approval rating is 6%, but yet every year, every 2 years, people still come out and vote for them. Mm-hmm. So if you're voting for them, then you still believe in it, and therefore that's the reason that it keeps happening. Yeah. Even though you don't approve of what they're doing, you still believe that they're doing something, so you're still believing in the system in a way.
The problem is that there's a kind of game of the chicken. Okay. No, it's just chicken. It's like a game of chicken where if they play the game and they win, then you're going to suffer the consequences of that game, whether you play or not. And so you might as well play the game. I mean, I think that enough voters. I mean, I suspect that a significant portion of voters vote from a purely pragmatic sort of perspective. They don't vote necessarily from an ideological perspective. they kind of look at their cards and they're like, fuck it, let's try for this one. And they just push and they put enough energy so that that's cost effective. And they just, I mean, that's some people are certainly like that, but not all of them, right?
Doesn't that kind of, you presume the power of voting? Doesn't it presume that you could possibly have a pragmatic effect in the first place by exercising the vote? Like, what about the possibility that voting means almost nothing? Like, let's suppose there's 100% chance, like, okay, so out of a percentage, out of a pie, out of a chance that we could do something by voting. Let's suppose from on the one hand, there's a 100% chance that voting is meaningful and will change stuff. And then on the other hand, there's a 0% chance that voting will change anything. My perspective is that, like, voting is basically like a 1% chance, maybe a 0.5% chance that it could change anything. Luckily, it's also a very low cost, it's a very low cost proposition to show up. But at the same time, like, I'm not kidding myself that if I show up to the voting booth, that I don't personally think that's going to do a whole lot of anything at all.
But it's not about the statistical likelihood that it will happen. It's about the public recognition that enough people want it. So
exactly, because
is that the only way to figure out public recognition, whether people want it? Like, voting is the only way to figure that out?
No, but it's the most popularly adopted way today.
Yifan, what were you saying, Yifan?
The more efficient gets adopted at scale, then this is like one of the ways we reach consensus about things. And we'll see it with Brexit, right? So with Brexit, the general populace voted for Brexit, but the powers that be were like, fuck you guys. And the consequences of my theory there would be that at some point there's going to be some kind of significant conflict, because now you have reasonable evidence that the populace wants a small majority or a majority wants out, and basically there's a conflict coming from that, right? And there might happen, and maybe they'll roll over, but it helps.
I mean, a counter argument. A counter argument to Anthony's point, and I guess it's not really a counter argument, but he's coming from a perspective that we vote in order to affect change. Certainly that's the ideological position advanced. But on a more important level, to me personally, it's not so much the fact of whether your vote has any direct consequence, as much as it is the fact that you can vote has a direct consequence. And just to explain that a bit more, it's just there's an incredibly strong correlation between states that have free, open elections over a long, consistent period of time, and that with a good track record in human rights and civil liberties, as opposed to states where that is not a possibility, or where it has not been a possibility for very long, or that the act of voting has no significant influence on the state itself. So on a more meta level, it's kind of like a symptom of whether or not you're part of one of the healthiest societies that currently exist in the world or not.
Yeah, and there's a cost.
Anthony, you're muted.
Sorry. I would ask, thank you. Is that causal in nature, or is that correlated? We would expect that very repressive regimes just wouldn't care about what people would vote for, right? So does it mean that voting is the cause of these liberties, or is it just sort of correlated?
And it could be that.
No, I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't argue that voting is the cause. No, but I also don't think that it's some coincidence either. I think that if I were to tell a story about why that correlation exists, it might go something like, voting is kind of the current place on the path that we've come to, that we started, I guess, during the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment facilitated all these social changes that we experienced that eventually led to liberal democracy. And you know, so like one of the fundamental aspects of a liberal democracy is the right to vote. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a cause, but it's a road mark of being on that road of liberal democracy.
So I would definitely tend to agree with you there. Voting is kind of a byproduct of the recognition of the right to self-determinacy, right? If a population, if people as individuals and as groups have the right to determine their own future, then it seems natural that out of sort of a fiefdom, or, you know, sort of a vassal states, a feudal system, that generally pervading recognition could very easily and in fact did result in voting as a recognition of the general consciousness of the population. I think it's possible that we could argue that as we continue to understand what it means to have individual liberties and individual sovereignty, self-determination, we might eventually start recognizing that, well, voting itself doesn't, just because an appeal to popularity does not give groups of people the right to oppress others. I'm like all about voting. Like blockchain is inherently about voting, right? If you're Bitcoin and you want to upgrade to a new software, to a new consensus, it's all done by voting. And so it's not that I'm against the concept of voting at all. It's just that in the specific case of voting for rulers for the state, where the inherent recognition by most of the population is that these people have the authority and the right to tell us all what to do, to boss us around. You know, that's more of the opposition there that I'm expressing. And personally, and one more thing about it is I'm very much doubting, one, whether or not those votes are even real. Like when we talk about electronic voting, we talk about stolen votes, like even the supposition that those things are accurate reflections of the mood of society, I don't think that that's really, there's a strong case for that. Right, like half of the people in America didn't even vote, for example, just as one small data point, right, that we can look at. So yeah, I very much doubt that the accuracy of those results, especially when there's the incentive to cheat. And then I also doubt whether or not actually voting helps at all. Like, okay, it's low cost for us to go vote, but at the same time, like, does it help? I don't think so. Maybe.
So your ideological position is that you reject the Leviathan.
Yeah, and I don't want to give them power. I don't want to give them my mental energy by pretending that their system is legal, or by even the potential for my actions to be perceived as saying, oh, well, it's legitimate, or, oh, it could actually help change anything, because I think it's very likely that most of those votes aren't accurate representations. They're not honest. There's no integrity there. And so the last thing that I want to do is have the outward appearance that I'm supporting that in any form or fashion, or pretending that it could actually be something that it by its very nature is not.
Okay, so and then I think the question that then flows from that position, it's a question I think that plagues anti-authoritarians and anarchists and you know, anyone, libertarians, anyone who opposes the existence of the state, is that generally in cases where the state ceases to exist, you get a power vacuum. You know, that's something that happened in a place like Somalia. And when you have a power vacuum, generally you get groups of armed groups, aggressive armed groups who vie for control, and it creates you know, an anarchic situation that is disorderly, and people suffer. And so, you know, like the question that you grapple with then, therefore, is how do you get rid of the state? How do you eliminate the Leviathan and not have the power vacuum, but instead replace it with some alternative orderly form of organizing society?
Anthony, I think you're muted again.
Yes, yeah, and his camera's off too.
Oh no, did we lose him?
Yeah, sorry, my my Bluetooth was running out of juice, so I had to go run and find some headphones. So I didn't want to make a bunch of noise and you don't have the camera be doing that number. Okay, so Larken Rose makes a really good argument or case about the concept of a power vacuum. So if I understand what you're saying is that because a power vacuum could develop, we need to just sort of accept the state of how things are right now. We need to accept the government as it exists now, because if we did away with the state, there would be a power vacuum, which would result in an even worse situation than we're in right now. Is that pretty close to what you're saying?
Well, no. I mean, I'm not necessarily justifying the existence of a state. I mean, I certainly think that there are some benefits to the existence of a state. But my question is more so like, you know, we have this documented pattern of power vacuums occurring in the collapse of a state. So like, you know, if you don't want the state to exist, like you have to have kind of like a strategic plan as to how to avoid that sort of situation, right? Because the ideal is that we learn from history.
Yeah, and there is evidence of like the state fails, and what happens is a bunch of smaller states form, and then they start having power conflict, which ends up in conflict and violence. And that doesn't mean that the state was benevolent, but the greater level of consensus. When consensus at a high level breaks, smaller groups like in fractions, and it becomes, and maybe that's adaptive. Maybe the fundamentals of the society changed enough that that's an adaptive phenomena. But maybe when you intentionally destroy a particular consensus strategy, say in Ukraine, or you know, one of the theories of Ukraine was that George Soros installed a set of provocateur activists that manufactured democratic consent and, you know, took down the state. Then you had a right. It can happen if enough people were sovereign enough and responsible enough and willing from an individual volition perspective, willing to not steal fundamentally, because that's a fundamental crime is theft, then you wouldn't need a state, you wouldn't need blockades, you wouldn't need any kind of security strategy, so people would not steal. As long as there's theft, you have a cost of protecting property, and as long as there's a cost of protecting property, somebody has to pay that for there to exist private property, and those costs are somewhere. And I suspect that, well, they're certainly like in modern nation states, because they're ancient structures, they have a huge amount of fat that comes from history that has changed, fundamentals that have changed, right? So NATO is a really good example of that, right? Like it was a super that was created in order to keep certain political powers on check, but those political structures have transformed into different things now, but NATO's still around. And so there's a lot of fat to cut, but, you know, at the end of the day, we can't really get to sort of the libertarian self-sovereign utopia until everybody gets there. In the meanwhile, we're going to have to like form our own defense systems to protect property rights from those that don't believe in libertarianism. And
or go ahead, Arielle.
I was actually just going to say, it's not just property rights either. It's also like potentially if someone wants to assault someone or rape someone, like protection from violence. But yeah, I was just going to say, I'd like to hear Anthony's direct response to Yifan's question, because
individuals, okay. So the individual is its own property. So
first of all, my phone died, so I had to go run and plug it in. I disappeared, so I probably didn't hear all of Juan's question. I can't both put my earbuds in and also charge my phone simultaneously. So if there's like echoes or the sound quality is really bad, please let me know.
Okay.
Okay, but so can you state your question, Juan, in a succinct way?
No, it was Yifan's question from before that I was curious about your answer to. Like, how do you if you're gonna like take like that stance against the Leviathan, like where do you see a path to like a world beyond a state?
Okay, so that's a really, really like open-ended question that definitely requires a narrative to answer. Is it okay if I address the power vacuum concept real quick before like sort of going on a narrative about
Yeah,
like a path towards freedom? So in terms of the power vacuum, I mean, kind of what I'm hearing is that, well, without the sort of homeostasis situation where there's this state that is violent by its nature, and sure, it enforces, right, it helps to keep some of the violence between individuals down, but then it of course puts its own form of violence out there to maintain its own power and control. And we need look no further than the American police state, right, where flowers are illegal and selling lemonade is illegal, and where it's done kind of terrible things to all kinds of people over the world. So the argument is that, well, if we didn't have that, right, without that sort of existence there, without that sort of thing with power to create some sort of stability, there would be a power vacuum, and then there would be warlords and there'd be fighting, right? So it's that we'd still have violence. The violence would still be there. It would just be maybe a little bit different in nature, and the players would be different. So it's kind of like saying, okay, so the worst case scenario is that if we have anarchy, a power vacuum develops, and then what do we get? Warring factions and gangs, which is exactly what we have now, except it's sort of a much more monolithic gang. I'm not saying entirely monolithic, but monolithic in its nature. Like so the worst case scenario is in a power vacuum, we're still going to have warring gang factions, which is what we have now. Like, what is Syria? What is America? What is Russia? What is seriously, we still have.
So hold on.
Hang on, guys. I think we need moderation because it's becoming a debate. Okay, Yifan, what's your?
Well, so okay, yes, that is true. I've heard that argument before. So, but then the substantial piece, here is not that violence does or does not exist, but that the actual quantity of violence is lower under the existence of a Leviathan, that because the Leviathan holds a monopoly on violence, the Leviathan is able to dole it out in quantities that it views to be sufficient, right? Like, and so it's not like, let's talk about Yugoslavia, for example, right? There was this quote that I read somewhere about, what had happened there, and it went something like, we all loved each other under Tito because Tito forced us to love each other with, the police and with guns. So it's, the idea is not that there's always a set level of violence that's going to happen in a society, and that when the state disappears, that the violence is just kind of like dispersed through all different players. Like the argument is that the violence increases.
So if I understand I just want to make sure I understand what you're arguing or what your point is. It's that that if it weren't for the Leviathan, there would be more violence in quantity and severity than there is right now, absent the Leviathan.
Yeah, I mean that's the argument of proponents of the state. Like, okay. Anyone who believes that the state should exist is almost certainly going to say that without the state, the total quantity of violence would be greater.
And so it would be, there's a really easy counter examples to that, to say something like, well, what about Russian communism in Maoist China, right? What about all the people and all the wars that even America, which is supposedly supposed to be liberty, has propagated around the world, and all the millions that have died as a direct result of America's actions, whether it's Vietnam, Syria, Iraq, right? So we could make that speculation, but I'm not sure that we actually have enough evidence to really make the statement that it would be worse without the Leviathan. Like, that could be the case. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm not sure that there's really enough evidence to make the definitive statement, right? That's how I'm not saying that's the argument. That's how I would respond to someone making that argument.
There's no direct evidence that exists. There's like the evidence that one would probably need to consider would be historical evidence, because in this day and age, the Leviathan is almost ubiquitous. I mean, you could take for example, a place like Somalia, but that you know, we could discard that as an outlier because there's not a whole lot of evidence.
I would actually make the argument in Somalia's case that the violence there is directly due to statism, and that when governments leave Somalia alone, it's actually quite peaceful, and it does even better than its neighbors when you start looking at all kinds of different health and wellness statistics. When it's left alone, that is.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not attached to my point in bringing up Somalia is that it's one of very, very few contemporary examples. I mean, I think the only comparisons that you would be able to make would be for like pre-industrial societies, like tribalist societies, way back when, you know, thousands of years ago, before the state existed there, and so there's a debate as to whether that constitutes a legitimate comparison or not. But if you accept the argument that it is a legitimate comparison, then you need to find some way to match the metrics, right? And then so
comparison to what? Sorry, I'm a little bit lost here. We're comparing Somalia,
society, right? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I understand the comparison you're drawing. It's Somalia to, or what's the comparison you're drawing?
Well, if you want to compare, like, you know, how peaceful life is under a Leviathan or not under a Leviathan, you're forced to compare like life under a nation state today to life under tribalism thousands of years ago, right? Because that's the only example of humans living outside of the Leviathan is that we have is
a historical example that I've heard referenced very generally, and I really would love to fact check this further, but apparently after the fall of Rome, what was left was the sort of certain religious superstructures that were kind of, you know, obviously the Vatican and the popes and this sort of religious structure that existed after the fall of Rome, after the fall of the state. And it was basically a theocratic order that was sort of maintained through belief itself, right? And they were kind of like, that was how consensus sort of happened. And then when the printing press happened, there was a kind of there was a decentralization of the order decision process. So before the printing press, only a select few of academics who understood the language could read and thus interpret the word of God. After the printing press, people started translating the Bible, and through those translations, people could become source interpreters of the word of God. And the result was a huge kind of magnification of sub-religious groups that kind of spread throughout Europe. And then what I'm told, the history that I heard that kind of surprised me was that there was actually a significant amount of sort of religious conflict between these groups because they had fundamental motivational perspective beliefs that drove behavior, and those behaviors conflicted because there was a break in consensus, general consensus. And maybe it was really good that there was breaking consensus because the established order before the printing press was clearly quite corrupt. And so maybe to me, like, this question of the state versus no state or Leviathan is not a binary, it's not a dichotomy, or it's not a binary sort of proposition. It's like there may be times when the net psychological potential for violence is high enough that a super consensus suppressing it is justified, or at least it's stable. And there may be times where people evolve enough so that psychological violence potential lowers. And so the superstate is now enforcing more violence to maintain security than is needed. And that's when revolutions happen to reorganize that consensus. So it may be, that's kind of how I see it now. And a lot of the whole idea that anarchy will break out if you don't have a state is actually an Enlightenment era, more or less, situation, that like critique of anarchy.
From what I can tell, like in situations where the state has collapsed or been overthrown by a revolution, it seems like I don't really see the reversion to like a tribalistic or anarchistic like state. It seems more like there's like over and over what happens is another state pops up that's like far more violent and oppressive and brutal than the one that came before. Like you look at like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Iran, like countless examples.
There's a battle for rulership, which is not anarchy in any sense. When people are like, well, when the state breaks down, you get anarchy. No, you get a battle for rulership. And we saw this at the break of the Soviet Union. So when a communist government that is basically as totalitarian as you can get for a state, whether it's communist or fascist, the way that the government functions is as a gang, as a mafia. And because of that mafia state and the indoctrination into this mafia through propaganda, all of the people start believing in mafias as the rulership. So when a communist or fascist state breaks down, the people only knowing how to act as a mafia and be part of a gang start to create their own small mafia gangs that then war against each other to become, again, the most powerful mafia. So, but in that breakdown, I don't historically see ways where those small mafia fractions do more damage and kill more people than the original Leviathan state mafia. You cannot compare what happened in the 1990s in Russia, where people were warring, and that was one of the reasons that my dad had moved us over to America. You cannot compare the amount of people who died in the 1990s to the amount of people who were murdered during Stalin's, reign of power. So
I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I think that argument is completely invalid and can be disproven over and over again in every single, same thing with Rome, same thing with, breakdown of, Germany after World War II. I just don't see any correlation of smaller gangs or tribes ever causing as much damage as a monopolistic state.
Now, okay, so in the example of Soviet Russia and the communist state, that happened after there was a kind of feudal aristocratic state that was also corrupted. So there was sort of an aristocratic state that was very, very extremely wealthy, and the net poverty and sort of misery of the general populace was so low that like the gap between the rich and the poor was so vast that the poor were very vulnerable to a sort of the Marxist narrative. And post,
But Juan, I got to interrupt you there, man. That's the same, like whether it's communism or whether it's a feudal vassal sort of king state, they're both monolithic in nature. They're both they just traded one monolithic system for another monolithic system.
Yeah.
They're not the same though. I mean, they're completely different. Like they're completely different kinds of systems, and they have completely different you can't compare the war in Iraq was horrible. It was horrible, but at most 1.5 million people died in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and that's like the major U.S. wars of that decade. You have hundreds of millions of people dying under.
Yeah, exactly, because the American system was less monolithic. There was the notion of liberty in America, whereas Russia, it was like, nope, you sacrifice everything to the communist state. And we weren't comparing America to communism. What we were comparing was, I think Juan was making the point that they went from sort of, in Russia, they had all of the oligarchs, before the communist revolution in the early 1900s, right? You had sort of this feudal system that then created all this poverty, which then transferred into a sort of communist system. But when you go from a king feudal system into a communist system, they're both still authoritarian. So I think we're making that comparison, not necessarily between America and Russia.
I guess I just think it's kind of that sort of anarchist analysis. So they're both states. So they're both monoliths. It's just, I kind of think to understand what happened and why, I would argue what happened under Lenin and Stalin was so much worse than what was going on under the Tsar, at least at the end of their regime. You kind of have to look at the specifics of how those.
But no, I totally, I think I agree with you
and how
there.
those societies function.
I think I agree with you there, but the general point here that's being made is that when we go back through history, I think we could probably agree that communism, Marxism under Stalin, Lenin, and the whole Communist Party was far more authoritarian and monolithic than what had come before it. And then we saw the fall of communism in the 90s, and then Russia now has quite a lot more freedom than they had previously. I think what Anastasiya was pointing out, and what I definitely want to point out as well, reinforces that when we see these sort of monolithic states with a lot of power and a lot of centralized authority, that is where we see the highest tendency to the worst atrocities against humanity. And that when that Leviathan breaks up, what we tend to see historically is fewer atrocities and much less mass violence. And so I think in terms, we're not talking binary here, but in terms of the concepts of anarchy, I think that's a great, let me make this last little point, Juan, and then I'll give you the floor. But in terms of, if we're thinking about a spectrum here, not binary, but a spectrum, that really is a great case for, when we do adhere to these anarchistic principles, without, we sort of break up the Leviathan, we bring the power back down to a more grassroots level, we see much fewer atrocities, we see much better economic success and more liberty for everybody.
I don't think that the evidence really supports that. Like, from what I can tell, most anthropologists seem to think that, like, in pre-civilized societies, a higher proportion of people died in warfare. Like, you have less total people dying because there's fewer people, but...
Is that a valid comparison, though, to compare what we have society, to pre-society? Like, those are two different, completely different structures.
But if you're making the claim, what if you're going to compare the medieval? Because that's like the medieval's an example. The medieval's example of a situation where there was a massive civilization and it fell, and there was an uncivilized period or non-civilized period. I haven't run the numbers, but I'm pretty certain that more people were dying in warfare, not to mention disease and all kinds of other things in the Middle Ages than they are now.
Well, if you want to run the numbers on societies without a state, like I said earlier, you have to look at tribal society, because that's the only example that we have, and their per capita rates of death in warfare is like way higher than anything that we have today. But
there's no society. Tribes are not society. Like that's not society in the way that we mean it now. Like, we're talking about cities, right? We're talking about large groups in aggregate that are doing farming, right? Animal husbandry, farming, buildings, cities, right? Like, to compare the Paleolithic era of hunter-gatherer tribal warfare, right? To make that comparison to what we're trying to talk about libertarian concepts and how a libertarian society could look, that's not even apples to oranges. That's like, those are two totally different questions.
It's not necessarily Paleolithic. There's a lot of societies. There's a lot of societies like the North American societies, or even during the Middle Ages in Europe, that were non-civilized, but still. Sorry, Juan, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, let me just, because we have an example. We've discussed it from different angles, which is, the communist revolution of Mao, Lenin, and Stalin. Like, we had state before it and the state after, and so we can compare both sides of this question. It is not a spectrum, and it's not binary. It's dimensional. It's like, before Soviet Russia and the communist revolution, there was an aristocratic state that was a dominating kind of feudal system or something like that. And afterwards, they have sort of like the democratic-ish republic. Well, depends. Like, with Russia, it's sort of like, what is Russia? It's a republic.
So I'm going to say no, because this is for me.
In Russia.
Yeah, this is where me and Anthony completely agree. So, you have the pre-Soviet Russia empire monarchy, oligarchy, a small percentage of people at the top control everything. In Russia, you have the exact same thing. And there's a small oligarchical society around him that, Communist Party, then you get all the things that you want, and you have rulership over people. Same exact system. You walk into post-Soviet Russia, and it's the exact same thing, except now he's called the president, and the oligarchs are now the Duma or the Congress, and it's the exact same authoritarian system. So you can color them whichever way you want, but really all of these things, all the way from monarchy to feudalism to communism to post-democratic systems, they are all just oligarchies that rule over the majority of the people.
Well, I wouldn't say it's the same exact thing, because there's a
At a
like
fundamental level.
the political principles are different. Like, you wouldn't say like Russia has reasonable amount of property right today compared to communist Russia.
Sure, yeah, comparatively, but still in a stagnant economy, with the government still owning like 51% of probably the like energy industry, the
So
But I mean, if you look at,
I'd like to add on to what Anastasiya said there, and the only thing that I would add here is that I would agree with her in the sense that the nature of what was happening across the spectrum here is authoritarianism, right? It presumes the right to control others and tell them what to do. So these systems are similar in that manner, but Juan is also correct when he says that, well, there's clear differences between the Russian Republic today, right, and what was happening in the Soviet communist era. However, the one thing that I really want to point out here is that when we saw that sort of Leviathan totalitarian control of the communist government dissolve into something that's less authoritarian than it still is authoritarian, but less so than it was, we see the welfare of the people have gone up. We see that their liberties have gone up. And we see fewer atrocities occurring. So it's a data point that I would look and say, okay, here's a data point where when we had less authoritarianism, things improved. And we can see this. There are many, many examples. When authoritarianism and the Leviathan state decreases, we have better outcomes.
Okay, so what about the pre-communist sort of revolution, where you had a particular sort of aristocratic order, and I don't know the history back then. Maybe it was worse than the Soviet Russia, like the communist sort of, right? I would imagine it was not worse. I would imagine it got worse, right?
I would agree.
The collapse of the state, there's now an unmanifest set of potential states that can occur, and sometimes it's way worse, and sometimes it's maybe better, right? And like if instead of Lenin entering Russia right around that time, it had been like Mises, or one of these like libertarian economists, we could have had.
Philosopher.
Yeah,
Davy Crockett.
Really good example for this. Like in Chile, there was like this democratic communist state coming in and got democratically elected, then started sort of choking the economy through regulation, and then Congress allegedly, what I'm told, sort of gave military rights to Pinochet to sort of take out this, like make a coup on the president. So Pinochet took him out, like deregulated a bunch of stuff, got a bunch of the libertarian economists, Austrian economists to come in, set up the society, and then stayed in power for, something like 10 to 12 years, and then finally stepped down and, democracy was reestablished. And it's seen as the Chilean miracle, right? Where it was like a fascist sort of military intervention that resulted in a huge economic potential. But it could also have ended in a communist state that would have imploded the society, like happened, like we're seeing in Venezuela, neighboring country. So there's potentials.
I guess what I'm seeing here that I'm kind of wanting to question is, like, it seems like Anthony and Anastasiya are kind of proposing a model of, or maybe primarily Anthony and Anastasiya supporting it kind of, but so you guys are proposing a model of like ultimate hierarchy, ultimate Leviathan versus like ultimate anarchy, and the idea is that like just a linear.
I would reject that, actually. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't. That's not what we're proposing.
Well, you're proposing a spectrum. You're proposing a spectrum between authoritarianism and total. I don't know what you want to call it, non-decentralization, anarchy, like.
Yeah, okay, that's better. Yeah, we're painting a picture of a spectrum from total control, total authoritarianism to under total anarchy.
You seem to have a graph going. So on the x-axis, you have like how authoritarian a society is. On the y-axis, you have every measure of human prosperity, of like wealth and all this and freedom and all this stuff. And it seems to be proposing a relationship that's kind of like simple line going downwards, maybe. And I guess I want to question how useful that, like, it seems like you guys, it seems like Anthony, like you're mainly able to support that model by dismissing evidence from tribal societies, which problematize this side of it. And I guess I kind of ask why are we looking at it? What's the utility of looking at human history through that kind of, I would almost say, simplistic, single factor analysis?
Okay, so to answer the question about tribal societies, how are we going to, I would wonder, how are we going to possibly arrange our society as it exists now by trying to make comparisons to tribalistic? We can do that in terms of psychology. We can say, okay, humans have adapted to a sort of tribal mentality. How can we tailor our society to address those psychological needs?
Well, no, it's the argument you're making. It's the argument you're making. The argument you're making relies on saying that ultimately a more anarchistic, more free, less controlled, less state centralized society will be more free, more prosperous, and less violent. And there seems to be direct historical counterarguments to that claim. And so I'm asking, how do you account for that in your theory?
Okay, so allow me to paint a little bit of a picture here. If I understand correctly, what you've done is you've put we've created a spectrum from basically total authoritarian control on the one side, and then it seems like your model, the way you conceptualize complete anarchy, is basically tribalism, right? Tribalism from Paleolithic prehistoric times. Do I have that correct?
I want to make a distinction between Paleolithic and non-civilized. You can have I don't know, the Haida or something, or the Navajo. They were not Paleolithic, but they were non-civilized societies that were still
okay. So in terms of, okay, I got you. I'm saying Paleolithic is more, less of a timeline and more of okay, but I duly noted. Okay, so on the one hand, there's the authoritarian Leviathan, and then on the other, there's complete tribalism, right?
Say non-civilized societies, yeah.
Okay. So I guess, so by the first thing that I would sort of object to, and I'm not making an argument here necessarily, it's just that I object to the comparison of, we're trying to discuss what is the best structure, what are the best ideals and values for civilized society. So why would we use non-civilized society as a way of, as a value judgment mechanism, right? That by its very nature, definitionally, right, it's uncivilized. But to paint, to really, I really want to answer this question in a very complete way, if I can, to the best I can. So let's set aside the concept of pure tribalism for the moment, okay? And instead, let's just come to where we are right now. And let's come to our recent history. Let's look at our recent past, let's say the past 100 years or so, few hundred years, right? We have built higher technology, we have complex societies, we have cities, right? We have animal husbandry. We're not hunter-gatherers anymore, right? We have farming. And so in the recent past, from what we've seen, when we create structures that are very centralized in authority, they tend overall, and it doesn't mean this is the case every single time, but the tendency overall is for atrocities to happen, for the welfare of the general population to decrease. And in cases where we've seen a relaxing and a dissolution of some of that authoritarianism to less centralized control, less authoritarianism, we tend to see societies become more prosperous, successful, by all those kind of metrics that you mentioned, right? We could put them all, we could list a whole bunch of them. So what really, the case that I'm making now is not so black and white. I'm not making a case that we should go back to tribalism and we should be like Somalia, because that would be better and perfect, and we'd have our anarchist libertarian utopia. Okay, that would be a complete mischaracterization of I think the argument that Anastasiya and I are making. Quite simply, the argument that we're making is that given where we are right now in the world, with quite a number of centralized authorities, monolithic authorities, at least over geographic areas, we would see the only case that we're really making is that if we saw a dissolution somewhat, doesn't have to be complete, but at least if we took some steps towards decentralizing their power, right, towards reducing that centralized Leviathan monolithic control, that we would in fact see better prosperity for general humanity. Now, maybe at some point the situation would reverse, and if we decentralized any further, perhaps things would break down. But let's just go there in steps. Let's start reducing, right? If we have the ability, hypothetically, if we had the ability to reduce the power and centralization, we would see better outcomes, at least up to a point. So to the point that right now we at least need to take some steps towards freeing up the populations and reducing that Leviathan control.
I just want to point out that we were having a parallel conversation. I'm glad that you sort of made your case in a more sort of elaborate way because it sort of illuminated it for me. My position and the stuff that I talked about earlier was coming from a descriptive perspective. You know, my position is not what is the ideal way to achieve a more prosperous society. It was more like this is the nature of power and politics and the way that power structures form and dissolve and the potential and the stuff. So my position, my perspective was descriptive. And I certainly have prescriptive or ideological or sort of a vision of what could be and where I would like to see things going. And it sounds like, as you just elaborated, this is, you know, your position is how do we get there? And that's a fine conversation to have. But I'm glad that we've sort of been able to separate those two perspectives because there is the nature of power structures, or at least the nature of security versus violence. And there is by which means or strategies do we achieve your state or state of social stability or you know, something like that. And well, is it worth aiming that way, etc. Right? So that's it.
I mean, there's the whole Jordan Peterson thing that if you introduce too much chaos into a system all at once, you can end up with a catastrophic collapse that leaves you like more like Somalia than an anarchist utopia.
So Juan, I think you just said, I think I heard you say, how do we get there, right? You brought up the idea of how do we get there? And that opens up a whole new avenue of discussion, like how could we move from because I actually think that we probably most of us agree, I think we all probably agree that, right, a lessening of the centralized authoritarian power structures, at least to some degree, could be beneficial. Is that?
It depends where you want to go. I wouldn't agree with that unless you find where to go first.
Just to some degree, like I'm not saying like a complete dissolution of the state, like flipping a switch. I'm just saying like, I think my impression of everyone was that we don't want to see too much authoritarianism. We don't like, it would be better to see less authoritarianism. That doesn't mean that there might be no state structure, but at least like less of that. Right. And then so there's the question of, how do we do that? What's the best efficient, the most reasonable way to do that?
Well, one of the problems is that there's a sort of multi-layered dimension to that. So we would say that like most libertarians might say something like, I want full dictatorship grade authoritarian power over my immediate private property. Like I want to be the king of my house, but I don't want other people that are not owners of my house to tell me what to do in my house. And so there's, to say getting rid of authoritarian authority or power as a complete abstract, that's not a proper goal because it self-defeats, right? Like what people want is, what libertarians or property rights oriented people want is full authoritarian jurisdiction over their rightfully acquired property.
That's a great.
So I like that. You're challenging us to improve our language right now in terms of how we describe it. And I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Really, right, anarchy isn't all about no rulers, but if we take that to its logical conclusion, if there are no rulers, but decisions still have to be made, then who do you rule over for those decisions to be made? And the answer is because you only own yourself and nobody else, then you can only be ruler of yourself. And then that opens up the whole entire, road to self-responsibility and the NAP and the self-defense principle, et cetera, et cetera.
And it also opens the potential for a self-driven decision that affects the decisions of another. And that conflict of will is where potential, conflict of like physical conflict can arise. And so at the end of the day, everything ends up in like this sort of conflict resolution, conflict prevention, strategies, right? It always ends up there, and that's why I take it back to, as long as people are not willing to steal and have a clear enough sort of understanding of what theft is and all the forms of theft, then basically we won't need to play any more of these games. But until that happens at a big enough scale, and we'll always have to end up figuring out some way to protect against those that play a different game type of thing, or don't want to play our game or something like that.
Well,
So
I mean,
from that perspective, then, like, would you say that the Leviathan is a necessary evil on the way to achieving that goal, where we're all trying to play the same game?
Well,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Juan.
necessary evil, I would say that it's an inevitable consequence of that evil.
Okay,
So-
sure. Yeah.
Thought experiment that I've kind of played with that has sort of gotten me to, I guess, whatever position I'm in now, is that if you have let's say we end up, enough libertarians move to X, developing country, right? And we come with resources, knowledge, advanced knowledge and technology and stuff, and we start sort of forming our own private little sort of states, or like take over a neighborhood here, take over a neighborhood there, and then we rent or hire private security, and then we have private security kind of driving around, and we form our own sort of private property kind of state, right? Or sort of a stability, right? Based on the same principles, and it's all voluntary opt-in. So there's no coercion here. It's all private property, private security, right? Well, what happens if there's, let's say, two neighboring neighborhoods of libertarians with private security, and there's some conflict. Somebody does something that, like, let's say one leans towards environmentalism, the other one leans towards corporatism, right? And so the corporatists start sort of mining, like cutting wood over here, right? And the environmentalists are like, you can't just do that. It's going to damage the animals, which is going to hurt the potential nutritional value of the food that we're farming over here. There's a conflict, right? And let's assume that they're not sophisticated enough to settle it peacefully, and it escalates ideologically to a point where it's like a physical conflict. What ends up happening is it resolves at a melee level. So it's a sort of brute force game. It becomes whoever has the biggest game wins, and so the settlement of a conflict in that situation ends up tilting towards the one who has the biggest gang. So there's like a network effect of security resolution or manifestation that tilts towards the biggest gang, right? And so whatever the biggest gang wants or considers consensus is what's most likely to happen. And so what ends up happening is you end up playing games about how to control the biggest gang. And that's why we end up with things like the American Constitution and all these sort of political games. They're a way of controlling the biggest game because the biggest gang is always going to win, statistically speaking.
But
So,
both libertarian societies, and they both adhere to the principles of the NAP and self-defense principle and the law of no stealing, then how are they even justified in playing this game in the first place when libertarians technically supposedly say that they believe in a court system and in a justice system?
Well, I don't know that libertarians believe in a court system or justice system.
Well, they do, because they say that the only things that the government should control is the military, the court, and the...
Okay.
And
so you mean like, you're talking like minarchists?
Big L libertarian sort of minarchists.
well, yeah, well, that's what libertarians are. Anarchists, not all anarchists are libertarian.
I was thinking capital. Like hard.
I think Juan's example was actually really on point, because like I just read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and like a big part of that book is the idea that each person has absolute right to have full control over the product of their labor. So if you produce something, then you own that thing and no one can take it away from you. Like that whole idea is pretty central to it. The one thing I was thinking about is like when it comes to resources and like raw materials, like which is like in Juan's example, if you have like a forest, like no one produced that. Like who owns the initial raw materials in the land?
I have a lot of thoughts on this.
So take a tree, plant a tree. Pretty simple in my opinion.
So Juan and I were actually talking about this just a couple nights ago, and it's the concept of who has the right to the natural resources that we find ourselves surrounded by. And so I think to help illustrate this question so that we can answer it from an informed perspective, I think it's good for us to sort of look at two different sides of a spectrum. So let's start with the sun. Does anybody own the sun? Has anyone claimed it? Like, would it be legitimate for me to say, I claim the sun, it's mine, and you all have to pay me for my sunlight now? Like, is that legitimate? You know, or could I look at the moon and be like, hey, that's mine. Like, I claim the entire moon for myself. I own it now. Is that legitimate? You know, and if anyone goes to the moon and starts trying to do anything there, I'm like, nope, nope, that's mine. I'm going to charge you rent. I think all of us naturally be like, no, that's not legitimate. And where we really get into the interesting philosophical and intellectual discourse is, why is that not legitimate? What's wrong with that position? And then when we figure out, well, what's wrong with that position and why is that not legitimate? Now we can start applying it to real things around us. Like, let's suppose, let's take the desert southwest of the United States. Massive, massive land, uninhabited, unused for the most part, untapped. And so we say, by those same concepts, like, can I say, hey, I own 1 million acres in the desert southwest because I planted a flag, you know, along a river? No, like that doesn't meet a level of logical discourse and rigor, intellectual rigor to actually defend the case. So it comes back in a lot of ways to the burden of proof, right? If I'm going to claim that I own something and I have the right to exclude someone from using it, I need to prove my case. I need to present evidence and logic and real tangible reasons as to why I have the right of exclusionary control over that thing. And so obviously mixing your creativity with something, or let me take one step back. First comer, the concept of a first comer is a really important concept, right? If I'm the first one to go to a particular asteroid, in let's say the asteroid belt, and I start mining it and no one else is there, and I'm not harming anyone else, I haven't caused any harm to anyone else, and I'm the first one there, that's a pretty high level of claim, right? Like, there's not anyone else that has the right that can come and present a case for why they can exclude me from using it. Like I said, as long as I'm not harming anyone else. And then obviously the mixing of my creativity and of my labor over the physical resource, now that starts to confer even more justification for why I have the right to use it. Maybe I mine an asteroid and I build a spaceship. I mine all the metal out of it, right? And I build a spaceship out of an asteroid, hypothetically, right? I have a very high level of justification for why I have the right to control that thing.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I would approach the subject.
Okay, but here's the thing. If we're looking at Juan's example and there's these two communities and one's like, we want to log the forest, and one's like, we want to conserve the forest, and they're like they're trying to resolve it through logic and argumentation and precedence, then isn't that just become a legal system in a state that's larger than the two communities?
No, not. I mean, maybe it depends on how we define a state. I'm just trying to approach it from a purely logical.
It's a legal system that both communities agree on. Maybe it can be.
Are legal systems supposed to be based on logic and evidence and reasoning?
That's exactly what the legal system is.
Well, wait. That's what it's supposed to be, but that doesn't make.
So,
yeah.
The American sort of established legal system is a sort of a conflict resolution strategy. It has a sort of there's a kind of monopoly in a sense. There's not really a monopoly, actually. Like whenever you enter a contract with another party, or when you're a part of a company entering a contract with another party, you can actually select your own conflict resolution strategy in a settlement system that's outside of the Justice Department, outside the justice system. Now, there's certain institutions in the state that claim jurisdiction over you, whether you like it or not, and you can potentially defend yourself in court, and it's a pain in the ass because it's expensive and time consuming, and that's a problem in the current way of things. But in the example that I provided, there would be there's like a natural hierarchy, or there's a natural set of needs of conflict resolution. So that there's a range of possible strategies by which to resolve that conflict. And it ranges from pure melee resolution, which is going to be violent and bloody and a kind of, standoff, all the way up to a civil discussion in a meetup where you just talk it out. And the range in the middle would be a variety of sort of kind of possible ways to organize key players in a proper debate where you have moderation, and so people have to put some money in, or at least volunteer their time to do it, which means they have to give a damn. And so it's actually, that there's all kinds of ways that the conflicts can be resolved, but they will have to be willing. And it's the resource that is unclaimed, that there's no clear definition of who owns it, or by what means do you acquire proper claim over that resource. That's where the chaos is. And so you might say, well, they both believe in the NAP. What's the problem? Well, the problem is you need to define how to apply the NAP to a particular resource, right? So, for example, with the forest, well, one of the principles of a libertarianism is that you have, or one of the common things you'll find in libertarianism is the idea of homesteading. So whoever's working the land has a claim to the products of the land. If you claim to own the land, but then you never use it, you leave, then there's sort of, and if somebody moves in, one of the things you'll find in certain states is that they can actually claim over that property now because nobody's working it like you are.
But
and
then,
so
I would argue that since the government does, like, at least our governments now do own all of the land through property taxes, even if you own a piece of land and you're not using that land, the product of your labor is still going to the government to pay that rent. So therefore you are, like, in some ways, if somebody comes in and then starts using your land and producing whatever they want, and you're not able to use it whether you want to or not, you're still paying for that land.
yeah,
And obviously that's like outside of the realm of theory of property rights, because we don't have any property rights.
well, there's questions of whether their claim to that property is rightful or not, and that's a question on its own that we can for sure explore.
Well,
right?
and I think that distinction that Anastasiya just made is really critical because, yeah, sure, we can. One, you describe a situation that's basically, right, pursuit of power, right? Who has the power? Who has the melee ability to control whatever they want, right? And that's one way that the world does operate. Like, definitely, it's a power struggle, and he who is logically right isn't always correct. He who is logically correct doesn't always win. They don't always win that power struggle. But I think that one thing that we all value, and one reason why we're engaged in this conversation and in this podcast, is that we value objective truth to the extent that we can sort of reason it out, right? We value philosophy. We value the concept of, is someone correct, and how can we logically justify it? And so obviously, even if we do come to the correct logical justification, we're still going to have to enforce it in some way. And I just want to, in some ways, I feel like we've sort of confused these two issues, and I just want to make sure that there's a distinction made that, okay, sometimes the bad guy, quote unquote, right, bad guy wins. But we value the concept of creating mechanisms and justification for why things should be a certain way. And one of those is valuing personal freedom and sovereignty to act as you wish, as long as you don't hurt or harm others. And what is it to have property, to have legitimate ownership of property? Right. And then if we have to use force, we want to use our force to uphold those philosophical ideals, not just to take power for power's sake, for our own, for our own desires.
It should always be the last possible solution. And I think that's something that we as a society have lost along the way through, like, I don't know how long, or maybe never really learned it in the first place. The point is that that's why we have diplomats in our mental system now. We want to have conflict resolution with all of these different steps. And only until you have gone through the long, long process of all of these different steps and you still can't come to a consensus, well, then in that case, maybe force is required.
I want to illuminate another thing here, is that in that example of the two anarchist neighborhoods, or anarcho-capitalist neighborhoods, let's say, and over that conflict over the forest, what may happen is it starts as a kind of, Facebook drama, as it would in a libertarian community.
Passive-aggressive
Facebook post, and that starts a debate, and then it moves on to the meetup, and then somebody's like, okay, we got to figure something out because this is getting ridiculous. And so they establish they propose a potential conflict resolution strategy, and enough people show up, and then, maybe that works. But what may happen is that one of the parties that's involved says, fuck, I don't want to play this game. And so instead of going through that step, they, what I would say, escalate to simple capture of the property. So instead of going to the thing, that night, maybe they'll go and set up a wall, build a wall around the thing. And it's like, yeah, fuck you guys, right? And because that property is sort of in a quantum state of unsettled property rights, let's say, then
Liberland.
Then I think you would argue that's, yeah, exactly. Liberland is an interesting example. So what would happen is the people at debate, I think, would have a proper sort of claim to say, well, you over-escalated the conflict. There's a spectrum of conflict resolution strategies, and you went from here all the way to here. And so you were in the wrong. That's like building a wall around the property at that point would be the equivalent of initiation of force, even though it's not immediate force, right? It's sort of a capture, right? And in that sense, it's elusive, right? Because then the other person says, well, I'm not forcing everybody. I'm just building a wall, right? There's no gun to anybody's head. It's just a wall, right? And so you would have that debate, right? And so this what's interesting about this is that it illuminates the complexity of applying the non-aggression principle to a particular conflict. And it's the over-escalation, I find, that's really kind of the critical point of initiation versus defense. If that makes any sense, if that helps, yeah.
But then like people tend to like take that over-escalation and escalate it even more, when what you're supposed to do is bring it back down to the drawing board and then start over. It's obvious that the original consensus didn't work when somebody went off and built a wall. You have to come back and be like, well, so now you want to do this. Who was going to build a wall around all these different areas, and then is the new property lines drawn to the fact that you can only take the trees that are within your walls, and we can only take the trees within our walls. And then if you run out of trees, well, then you're out of luck. Sorry, man, like you chose this. Instead of maybe going to the place where, oh, well, you build a wall, so now we're going to, you know, climb over that wall and beat up everybody else on the other side of the wall.
Yeah, like what happened, the guy built the wall, is that the people at the debate were like, what the fuck? So they go and get a bulldozer, and then they just go straight for the wall. And the other side have like shotguns, and they're like, what the hell, man? And then war breaks out, right? And
so this is, now we're illustrating the, sorry, I think, go ahead, whoever was talking.
I was just going to say, I think that's like a perfect, like, I think you would need a legal system that's like meta to the two society, that both societies ascribe to, and that there's like a consequence, even if it's not a state. Like you could have all 10, you could have like 20 neighborhoods and the 20 anarchist societies in the region. And like, if anyone breaks the law or is like, any society is proven to break the law, then like they're like boycotted by the rest for some period of time, or no one trades with them or something.
So I think what's one thing Juan and Anastasiya have been illustrating here is kind of the deficiencies of relying solely on negative law. So negative law says you can't do this, right? You can't violate the NAP, right? You're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And if that's all we rely on, I think that's quite deficient for having a successful, peaceful society. In order for us to have a peaceful society, we also have to create positive values, right? Things that we wish to see. One of those things could be nonviolence, right? We say, hey, we value resolving conflicts in the least violent way as possible, right? We might also say, okay, we value love, or we value, right? We could create all kinds of positive values where we say, when negative law becomes deficient because it becomes too complex to figure out whether or not someone's NAP was violated, well, we should also take a look at has a person's actions been aligned to sort of these positive values that we have, such as nonviolence, such as mediation and conflict resolution, such as love and peace and prosperity.
Guys, I kind of got to go. Yeah. Do you guys want to keep talking? We're going past 3 hours, I think.
Oh, it's also been pretty long. So I would be okay with ending it soon. Does anybody want to continue, or should we last words?
I have one last point to make, and coming back to those values and coming back to the example. So I think one of the things that we do value as a society, and we talked about this at length today, is the scientific method. So you come and like go through the process really relies on the scientific method. So you reach some consensus, and then that consensus breaks. So therefore, you have to go back to the drawing board, because obviously your hypothesis for that consensus was incorrect to begin with. So maybe if we approach, you know, some of these issues with law and governance the same way that we do with science, we would be better equipped to handle some of the conflicts that do come up from time to time.
And I would end with saying that one of the problems with science and sort of Mao and some of these sort of terrible dictators kind of proved it after the scientific revolution is that you can grab science and you can point it towards torture, become very, very, very effective at torture.
Right.
And so science doesn't have a kind of motive. It's just a machine of truth discovery.
Yeah,
and
experimentation.
In service to the purpose.
Yeah,
and so,
finding the things that work.
Yeah, and so the purpose happens pre-science, even though you can try to sort of test the purposes with science and try to find if they're accurate. So maybe something like that would work. Thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Yeah, this was really, really fun. I'm glad I got to do this.
It's a little bit hot.
That was quite enjoyable.
Woo. Shirtless. Anarchy. We can't hear you,
you guys are
Arielle.
muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself. I have a really quick question for you guys before we turn off. So don't turn off after I stop recording. But yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. I'm gonna cut it now.
Share it with everybody. If you like this, definitely share it. If you got this far in, thank you. Congratulations. You have incredible focus. You are far from the average YouTube.
Anyone who made it here is a trooper, for sure. Okay, bye, guys.
Take care. Bye.